The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web of energy that flows through space and time. But what happens when something enters this galaxy that operates entirely outside its mystical laws, when fleets commanded by minds so brilliant they've never needed supernatural power arrive carrying weapons that make star destroyers look like primitive war galleys? The first sign was a distortion in hyperspace that no navicomputer in the galaxy could classify. Not the familiar blue-white tunnel of faster-than-light travel, but something stranger, a bleeding edge where two different methods of breaking light's barrier collided with catastrophic force. Emergency klaxons screamed across Imperial monitoring stations from the outer rim to the core worlds as sensor networks registered an impossible event. 23,000 massive signatures emerging from hyperspace simultaneously across a 3-parsec sphere near the Epsilon sector. No armada in galactic history had ever jumped with such precision. No fleet possessed 23,000 capital ships. And yet the sensors didn't lie. In the command center of the Super Star Destroyer Executor, Admiral Piot stared at the holographic display with the expression of a man watching his understanding of reality collapse. The signatures were wrong, not the familiar Imperial wedge shape or rebel starfighter swarms, but something else entirely. Ships ranging from 300 meters to over 1,000, organized in geometric formations that made no tactical sense according to any doctrine in the Imperial archives. "Admiral," his communications officer said, voice tight with barely controlled panic, "we're receiving transmissions from the anomaly. Multiple frequencies, none matching any known protocol. Audio only, no visual." "Put it through," Piot ordered, though every instinct screamed this was a trap. Static filled the bridge, then resolved into voices speaking a language that was almost but not quite basic, recognizable words mixed with incomprehensible syntax, as if someone had taken Galactic Standard and run it through a linguistic evolution that took 1,000 years down a different path. "Identify yourselves immediately. This is Fleet Admiral Reinhard von Lohengramm of the Galactic Empire, Goldenlow flagship. You have 30 minutes to respond with your intentions before we classify you as hostile." Piot felt his blood turn cold. Another Galactic Empire? Impossible. Unless... Before he could formulate orders, a second transmission cut through on a different frequency, this one calmer but no less authoritative. "This is Admiral Yang Wen-li of the Free Planets Alliance, flagship Hyperion. We appear to have encountered a navigational anomaly. We mean no harm and request immediate communication to establish our current position and intentions." Two fleets. Two commanders claiming authority from governments that didn't exist. And both now sitting in Imperial space with enough firepower to level a sector. "Get me Lord Vader," Piot said quietly. "And alert the Emperor. We have a situation." 3,000 light-years away, on a modified CR-90 Corvette running silent in the Anoat sector, Rebel intelligence officer Vera Salas nearly dropped her datapad when the long-range sensors registered the anomaly. She'd been tracking Imperial fleet movements for 6 months, mapping patrol routes and supply lines, building the kind of intelligence that might give the rebellion an edge in their desperate war against overwhelming odds. This wasn't an Imperial movement. This was something else entirely. She brought up the deep space sensor logs, filtering through the electromagnetic noise and hyperspace residue. What she found made her mouth go dry. Thousands of ships, but not Imperial designs. The energy signatures were all wrong. Fusion reactors operating at efficiency levels that shouldn't be possible, weapon systems that registered power outputs comparable to planetary defense arrays, and most disturbing of all, no trace of the standardized Imperial construction that marked every ship in Palpatine's navy. "Captain Tyrius," she called to the corvette's commander, "we need to transmit this to command immediately. Priority Alpha." "What am I looking at, Salas?" "Either the Empire just unveiled a secret fleet that makes everything we know about their capabilities obsolete," she said slowly, pulling up comparative analysis, "or someone else just entered the galaxy with enough ships to fight the Empire to a standstill." Tyrius studied the data, his scarred face betraying nothing. He'd been fighting since the Clone Wars, had seen the Republic fall and the Rebellion rise from its ashes. But even he looked shaken. That's more capital ships than the entire rebel fleet has operational, he muttered. More than most sector groups. And they're talking, Sulas added, routing the garbled transmissions through her linguistic analysis protocols. Two separate command structures, two different governments, neither one matching any known galactic polity. Captain, I think we just witnessed first contact. With who? She looked up from her screens, and for the first time in her career as an intelligence officer, Vera Salas had no answer to give. Aboard the Brunhild, Fleet Admiral Reinhard von Lohengramm stood before the main viewscreen with his hands clasped behind his back, golden hair catching the light from 1,000 holographic tactical displays. At 27 years old, he had conquered an empire, unified warring fleets under a single banner, and proven himself the greatest military mind of his generation. He had never lost a battle. He had never faced a situation he couldn't calculate his way through. This was different. Report, he said quietly, the single word carrying absolute authority. Chief of Staff Paul von Oberstein adjusted his artificial eyes, cybernetic replacements that gleamed with cold calculation. Navigational systems are completely disoriented. Star charts don't match any known configuration. Spectral analysis of nearby stellar bodies suggests we are no longer in Imperial or Alliance territory. That's impossible, said Vice Admiral Wolfgang Mittermeier, his scarred hands gripping the tactical rail. You can't just leave the galaxy, Oberstein. And yet we have. Oberstein's voice carried no emotion. Analysis of local electromagnetic signatures suggests a technologically advanced civilization, but their communications protocols are completely alien. Linguistically similar enough to Imperial standard for basic translation, but divergent enough to suggest centuries of isolated development. Reinhard turned from the viewscreen, his ice-blue eyes scanning the bridge. Every officer here had followed him through impossible odds, had trusted his genius when logic said they should retreat. They looked to him now for answers. Young Wen-li, he said softly. Has there been any contact with Alliance forces? Confirmed, Admiral, his communications officer reported. We've detected Alliance fleet signatures approximately 2 light hours from our position. Approximately 8,000 capital ships, led by the Hyperion. A ghost of a smile touched Reinhard's lips. Of course. If fate had thrown him into an unknown galaxy, it would naturally include the one opponent whose strategic mind matched his own, the man who had thwarted his ambitions more times than he cared to admit, who won battles through intellect rather than strength. So the magician is here as well, Reinhard mused. How appropriate. A new galaxy, a new war. He turned to his fleet commanders. Begin standard reconnaissance protocols. I want full sensor sweeps of this region, analysis of all local transmissions, and identification of major power centers. If we are to conquer this galaxy, we must first understand it. Conquer, Admiral? Mittermeier asked carefully. Reinhard's smile widened, carrying the dangerous edge that had made him legend. Did you think we came here to negotiate, Wolfgang? We are the Galactic Empire. Wherever we go, we bring order. And if this galaxy already has an empire, his eyes gleamed with ambition undimmed by dimensional displacement. Then they will learn what true Imperial power looks like. If you want to see more legendary commanders enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Aboard the Hyperion, Admiral Yang Wen-li sat in his command chair with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, staring at star charts that made absolutely no sense. Around him, his bridge crew worked with the disciplined efficiency of veterans who had learned to trust their commander's unconventional methods, but even they couldn't hide their unease. Admiral, we've completed preliminary analysis, his tactical officer Lieutenant Frederica Greenhill reported, her normally steady voice carrying a tremor. None of these stellar configurations match Alliance or Imperial star charts. We're not just in unknown territory, we're in an entirely different galactic region. Possibly a different galaxy altogether, Yang finished quietly. He set down his tea and rubbed his tired eyes. Which means our war is over. We can't fight the Galactic Empire if we can't even find our way home. Sir, we're detecting another fleet, his sensor officer called out. Imperial configuration, approximately 15,000 ships. And, he paused, incredulous. Admiral, it's him. We've identified the Brunhild signature. Reinhard von Lohengramm is here. Yang closed his eyes and sighed deeply. Of course Reinhard was here. The universe had a cruel sense of irony. Throw him into an unknown galaxy, strand him impossibly far from home, and naturally his greatest opponent would be right there with him, probably already planning conquest. Any sign of local military forces? Yang asked. Yes, sir. We're detecting what appear to be patrol fleets, primarily concentrated around major inhabited systems. Their ships are primitive, Admiral. Wedge-shaped capital ships with obvious design inefficiencies, reliance on visible turbolaser batteries rather than axial cannons, and what appears to be minimal point defense networks. Yang leaned forward, interest peaked despite his exhaustion. Primitive doesn't mean weak, Lieutenant. It means different tactical doctrine. What's their fleet composition? Large capital ships supported by small fighter craft. Very small, single or dual pilot configurations. The fighters appear to be the primary strike element, which is, Frederica trailed off, consulting her tactical database. Admiral, that makes no sense from an efficiency standpoint. Fighters can't carry enough firepower to threaten capital ships. Unless this galaxy's weapons technology operates on different principles than ours, Yang mused. He stood, pacing the bridge with the thoughtful stride of a historian examining an ancient battlefield. We need information. And more importantly, we need to understand the political situation before Reinhard starts doing what Reinhard does best. Which is, sir. Yang smiled grimly. Winning. We may have been enemies, Lieutenant, but I never underestimated Reinhard von Lohengramm. He's brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless when he needs to be. If he sees opportunity in this galaxy, he'll seize it. And if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves fighting not just him, but whatever local powers exist here as well. He returned to his command chair and picked up his cold tea, taking a sip despite the temperature. Outside the view screen, an unfamiliar galaxy stretched endlessly, full of unknowns and dangers his democratic ideals wouldn't let him ignore. Send a message to the local forces on all frequencies, Yang ordered. Standard first contact protocols. We come in peace, we mean no harm, and we're very interested in talking before anyone starts shooting. And if Reinhard doesn't extend the same courtesy, sir. Yang's smile turned sad. Then we'll do what we always do, Lieutenant. We'll win the unwinnable battle, save lives nobody thought could be saved, and hate ourselves for being good at war. The Hyperion's communications array began broadcasting into the unknown, carrying the voice of a man who had never wanted to be a soldier, speaking to a galaxy that had never heard of the legend of the Galactic Heroes. But soon, very soon, they would learn. The Imperial Security Bureau's monitoring station on Brental 4 detected the transmissions within hours. Within 6 hours, those transmissions had been analyzed, translated through 17 linguistic protocols, and forwarded directly to Imperial Intelligence Headquarters on Coruscant. Within 12 hours, they sat on the desk of the one man in the galaxy whose authority superseded even Grand Moff Tarkin's legacy, the Emperor's right hand, the Dark Lord of the Sith himself. Darth Vader stood in the meditation chamber aboard the Executor, studying the translated transmissions with interest that bordered on curiosity. The Force had warned him of something, a disturbance, yes, but not the usual ripples caused by Force-sensitive beings or even major galactic events. This was different. This was silence where there should be presence, emptiness where there should be connection. These newcomers existed outside the Force's awareness, as if they occupied space without truly belonging to it. Lord Vader, Admiral Piatt's voice crackled through the chamber's communications system, carefully respectful as always. We have established preliminary communication with both fleets. They claim to be from something called the Galactic Empire and the Free Planets Alliance respectively, though neither government exists in any Imperial records. Their commanders, Vader said, his mechanical breathing filling the silence between words. What do we know? Very little, my lord. The first identifies as Fleet Admiral Reinhard von Lohengramm, age unknown, commanding approximately 15,000 capital ships. The second is Admiral Wen-li, also age and background unknown, commanding 8,000. Both appear to be military leaders of significant authority in their respective governments. Vader's gloved hand clenched slightly. 23,000 capital ships represented more military power than most entire sectors could muster. If these forces proved hostile, even the Empire's vast navy would be pressed to contain them without significant losses. Prepare a diplomatic envoy, Vader ordered. I will meet with these admirals personally. My lord, is that wise? We know nothing about their capabilities or. They know nothing of the Force, Admiral. Vader's tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. That ignorance makes them dangerous but not invulnerable. Prepare the shuttle. I will assess whether these newcomers serve the Empire or die by its hand. The Lambda-class shuttle that approached the Brunhild bore Imperial markings and transmitted clearance codes that Reinhard's cryptographers confirmed were legitimate for this galaxy's power structure. Reinhard stood in the hangar bay with his senior staff arrayed behind him, Mittermeier, Oberstein, Admiral Neidhartmuller, and a full honor guard of Imperial soldiers in their immaculate uniforms. Remember, Reinhard said quietly, we are not petitioners. We are representatives of the Galactic Empire. Show no weakness, acknowledge no superior authority. Even if this empire they represent controls this entire galaxy. Muller asked. Reinhard's smile was sharp. Especially then. The shuttle landed with practiced precision, its boarding ramp extending with a hydraulic hiss. What emerged made even Reinhard's disciplined officers stiffen with surprise. The figure stood over 2 meters tall, encased entirely in black armor that reflected the hangar's lights with a predatory gleam. A flowing cape trailed behind him, and a helmet that revealed nothing of the being beneath stared at them with dark, empty lenses. But it was the presence that truly unsettled, not threatening in the conventional military sense, but something deeper, as if the very air around this figure bent to acknowledge his existence. I am Darth Vader, the figure said, voice distorted through his mask's vocabulator into something inhuman and absolute. Dark Lord of the Sith and emissary of Emperor Palpatine, sovereign ruler of the Galactic Empire. You have entered Imperial space without authorization. Explain your presence. Reinhard stepped forward, meeting that empty gaze without flinching. I am Fleet Admiral Reinhard von Lohengramm, Supreme Commander of the Imperial Navy. We experienced a catastrophic navigational failure that brought us to this region. We mean no intrusion, but neither do we recognize your empire's authority over vessels of our sovereign state. For a long moment, Vader simply stared at him. Reinhard felt something probing at the edges of his consciousness, not thought, not sensation, but something alien trying to read intentions that weren't written in any language or neural pattern this being could understand. You speak boldly for one who commands a lost fleet in hostile territory, Vader finally said. Your ships are formidable, Admiral. Your technology advanced. But you are 23,000 vessels in a galaxy containing millions of worlds and trillions of beings loyal to Emperor Palpatine. Bold words require stronger foundations. We have never required large foundations, Reinhard replied coolly. Only strategic superiority. Which, if you've analyzed our capabilities, you know we possess over your current fleet doctrine. Oberstein stirred slightly behind him, a warning that Reinhard was pushing too aggressively. But Reinhard hadn't conquered an empire through caution. He had done it by making powerful men recognize that they faced someone who would not yield, could not be intimidated, and possessed the capability to make his threats reality. Vader's head tilted fractionally. You believe your technology makes you superior. I believe, Reinhard said carefully, that your empire rules through fear and overwhelming force. Admirable tactics, but ones that reveal a certain insecurity in your strategic doctrine. Empires built on fear crumble when that fear is challenged. The temperature in the hangar seemed to drop. Several of Reinhard's officers reached subtly for their sidearms, but Vader made no overtly threatening move. Instead, he simply raised one hand, and Reinhard felt something impossible, a pressure against his throat, invisible and absolute, cutting off air without any physical contact. "You understand nothing of power, Admiral," Vader said quietly. "Your technology is impressive. Your strategic mind clearly formidable. But you are children playing with toys in a galaxy where true power flows through the Force itself." Reinhard couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, but his ice-blue eyes never left Vader's mask. He wouldn't give this being the satisfaction of seeing fear, even as his vision started to tunnel. "Lord Vader." Oberstein's cold voice cut through the tension. "If you kill Admiral Lohengramm, 15,000 capital ships will classify this as an act of war and respond accordingly. Your empire may be vast, but can it afford the losses required to destroy a fleet this size? Can you personally survive the strategic deployment of our axial main cannons focused on your current position?" The pressure vanished. Reinhard gasped for air, staggering slightly but refusing to fall. Vader lowered his hand. "Your subordinate is wise," Vader said. "You are fortunate to have advisors who understand what you do not, that arrogance without power is merely foolishness. And power without vision," Reinhard rasped, recovering his voice, "is merely tyranny. I have met tyrants before, Lord Vader. They all believed themselves invincible. They were all wrong." For another long moment, the two men, if Vader could still be called a man, stared at each other. Then Vader turned, cape swirling dramatically. "The Emperor will wish to meet you, Admiral Lohengramm. You will accompany me to Coruscant, where your fate and that of your fleet will be determined. Refuse, and your first experience of Imperial power will be a base Delta Zero operation on the nearest inhabited world within your fleet sensor range. 23,000 ships are formidable. But you cannot defend an entire galaxy." Reinhard's jaw tightened. A base Delta Zero, complete orbital bombardment, sterilization of all life on a planetary surface. The tactic was brutal, efficient, and utterly in character for an empire willing to demonstrate power through mass murder. "I will meet your Emperor," Reinhard said quietly. "But understand this, Lord Vader, I have toppled one corrupt dynasty. I will not hesitate to topple another if circumstances require it." Vader paused at the shuttle ramp. "You are interesting, Admiral. Few speak to me with such defiance and survive. I look forward to seeing whether your strategic genius matches your arrogance." The shuttle lifted off, leaving Reinhard and his officers standing in the hangar bay's echoing silence. "Well," Mittermeier said quietly, "that could have gone better." "On the contrary," Oberstein said, his artificial eyes gleaming. "We learned several critical things. First, this empire possesses capabilities that operate outside conventional technology, some form of telekinetic ability, apparently. Second, they rule through demonstration of overwhelming force rather than strategic efficiency. Third, and most importantly, they are concerned about our fleet strength. They wouldn't negotiate if they could simply destroy us." Reinhard rubbed his throat, still feeling the phantom pressure of Vader's power. "That force," he mentioned. "What do we know?" "Nothing, Admiral," Oberstein admitted. "But I suggest we learn quickly. Any capability we can't measure, predict, or counter represents a strategic vulnerability." Reinhard nodded slowly, his mind already racing through tactical calculations. This galaxy was more complex than he'd anticipated. But complexity created opportunity, and Reinhard von Lohengramm had built his legend on seizing opportunities that lesser men never saw. "Prepare the fleet for potential hostilities," he ordered. "And begin analyzing every scrap of data we can gather about this galactic empire. If I'm going to meet their emperor, I want to know exactly who I'm dealing with." Wen-li's first contact with the Rebel Alliance came not through dramatic shuttle landings or military confrontations, but through a simple, frightened transmission from a battered CR-90 corvette that had been monitoring the Alliance fleet for 6 hours before finally deciding to make contact. Unknown vessels, this is Rebel Intelligence Officer Vera Salas of the Alliance to restore the Republic, the transmission began, carrying the careful tone of someone desperately hoping they weren't making a fatal mistake. We've monitored your arrival and translated your transmissions. We'd like to talk, if you're willing. We're not your enemy. Yang smiled wearily. At least someone in this galaxy leads with dialogue rather than intimidation. Lieutenant Greenhill, establish communication. Full visual this time, let them see we're not hiding anything. The view screen flickered to life, showing a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting a losing war for too long. Behind her, Yang could see the cramped interior of a light corvette, functional, desperate, nothing like the vast capital ships of either his alliance or Reinhard's empire. Officer Salas, Yang said pleasantly, raising his cup of tea in greeting. Thank you for making contact. I'm Admiral Yang Wen-li of the Free Planets Alliance. As you've probably surmised, we're very lost and very confused. Any information you could provide about where we are and who we should be talking to would be greatly appreciated. Salas blinked, clearly taken aback by Yang's casual demeanor. You're commanding 8,000 capital ships and you're asking me for information. Knowledge is more valuable than firepower, Officer Salas. And right now, I have plenty of the latter but almost none of the former. Yang leaned back in his chair. Why don't you tell me about this alliance to restore the Republic? The name suggests you're rebels against some form of established government. Over the next hour, Salas explained, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence as she realized Yang was genuinely listening rather than interrogating. She described the fall of the Republic, the rise of Emperor Palpatine, the clone wars that had transformed a democracy into a dictatorship. She told him about the Death Star, the destruction of Alderaan, the scattered rebel cells fighting desperately against impossible odds. Yang listened to it all, his expression growing progressively more troubled. So let me make sure I understand, he said when she finished. Your republic became an empire through emergency powers that were never rescinded. Your democratic senate was dissolved. Your peacekeeping force, these Jedi, were systematically exterminated. And now a small rebellion fights against a military force that outnumbers and outguns them by orders of magnitude, with only hope and moral certainty as weapons. Yes, Admiral. That's essentially it. Yang rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar weight of impossible situations settling on his shoulders. And you want our help? We're asking, Salas said carefully, if you might be willing to at least not help the Empire. You have more ships than the entire rebel fleet has ever fielded. If you sided with Palpatine, the war would be over. And if we sided with you? Salas hesitated. Then for the first time since the Clone Wars ended, we might actually have a chance. Yang turned to Frederica, who had been monitoring the conversation with growing concern. What do you think, Lieutenant? I think, Frederica said slowly, that we've walked into someone else's war, Admiral. And that committing our forces without understanding the full strategic picture would be reckless. Agreed. Yang looked back at Salas. Officer Salas, I appreciate your honesty, and I genuinely sympathize with your cause. A democracy corrupted into dictatorship is a tragedy I know all too well. But I have 8,000 ships full of men and women who trusted me to bring them home safely. I can't risk their lives on partial information, no matter how noble your cause. Salas's face fell. I understand, Admiral. I hoped, but I understand. However, Yang continued, holding up a hand, I didn't say I wouldn't help. I said I wouldn't commit without information. So here's my proposal, send representatives to the Hyperion. Bring strategic data, fleet dispositions, political analyses, everything you have. Let me study this war the way I studied wars back home. And if I can see a way to help that doesn't amount to suicide for my fleet, then we'll talk about what alliance might look like. Hope rekindled in Salas's eyes. You do that? Just, study our situation. I'm a historian, Officer Salas. Studying impossible situations is what I do. Yang smiled tiredly. Though I should warn you, if I decide to help, it will be on my terms, using my tactics. I don't fight fair, and I don't follow conventional military doctrine. If that's acceptable, then we have the beginning of a conversation. Admiral Yang, Salas said, and for the first time since the transmission began, she smiled, I think the rebellion just found exactly the kind of ally it needs. After the transmission ended, Frederica turned to Yang with a knowing look. You're going to help them, aren't you? Regardless of what the strategic analysis shows. Yang sighed deeply. Probably. Democracy fighting against dictatorship, freedom fighters resisting tyranny, hope against overwhelming odds, it's a story I know too well, Lieutenant. I've been living it for 10 years. And the fact that helping the rebellion means opposing this galactic empire, which appears to share philosophical ground with Reinhard's government. That, Yang admitted, is just good fortune. If I'm going to be stuck in an unfamiliar galaxy fighting an unwinnable war, I might as well fight it against someone who deserves to lose. He picked up his tea, found it cold again, and drank it anyway. Outside the Hyperion's viewscreen, the unfamiliar stars of a new galaxy glittered with possibilities both hopeful and terrifying. And somewhere else in that same galaxy, Reinhard von Lohengramm was preparing to meet an emperor, with ambitions that would set the stars themselves ablaze. The Imperial Palace on Coruscant rose from the planet's surface like a monument to absolute power, kilometers of obsidian stone and reinforced durasteel, crowned with spires that seemed designed to pierce the sky itself. Reinhard observed it through the Lambda shuttle's viewport with the analytical eye of a conqueror who had seized his own empire's seat of power through a combination of military genius and political maneuvering. This structure was larger, certainly. More ostentatious. But fundamentally, it represented the same principle, one beings will imposed upon trillions. Impressive, Oberstein noted from beside him, artificial eyes recording every architectural detail. Inefficient from a defensive standpoint, too many ceremonial elements that serve no tactical purpose, but psychologically effective. This emperor understands symbolism. All tyrants understand symbolism, Reinhard replied quietly. It's governance they struggle with. The shuttle descended into a private hangar, where a full battalion of Imperial Royal Guards awaited, crimson-armored sentinels whose very stance radiated lethal purpose. Darth Vader stood at their center, an obsidian pillar of menace that made even the Emperor's elite guard seem almost mundane by comparison. The Emperor will see you now, Vader said without preamble. Your weapons will remain with your shuttle. Your bodyguards will wait in the antechamber. You will approach the throne alone. Reinhard handed his ceremonial sword to Mittermeier without hesitation. If the Emperor wanted me dead, he wouldn't need to lure me into his throne room to accomplish it. He turned to Vader. Lead on, Lord Vader. Let's see what manner of sovereign rules this galaxy. They walked through corridors that spoke of wealth beyond calculation, walls lined with artwork looted from 1,000 conquered worlds, floors of polished stone that cost more than most starships, ceilings that soared into shadow lit by artificial stars. Reinhard catalogued it all with the part of his mind that never stopped calculating. This wasn't just a palace. It was a statement, I am so powerful that I can afford to waste resources on beauty while my enemies starve. The throne room doors opened silently, revealing a vast chamber dominated by a single chair positioned at the center of concentric circles. And in that chair sat something that had once been human but had transcended, or fallen, into something else entirely. Emperor Palpatine studied Reinhard with eyes that glowed faintly yellow beneath the hood of his dark robes. The Force screamed warnings around this being, eddies of malevolence and calculation that would have driven a lesser Force sensitive to their knees. But Reinhard felt nothing, no supernatural dread, no psychic pressure. He simply saw an old man in a chair, surrounded by the trappings of power. "Approach, young Admiral," Palpatine said, voice carrying the rasp of great age and greater malice. "Let me look upon the one who claims to command an empire." Reinhard walked forward until he stood at the throne's base, neither kneeling nor bowing. "Emperor Palpatine. I'm honored by the audience." "Are you?" Palpatine's smile was a terrible thing. "I sense no honor in you, Reinhard von Lohengramm. I sense ambition. Brilliance. A hunger for power that rivals even my own." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what brings a conqueror from another galaxy to mine? Accident, as you claim? Or opportunity?" "Both," Reinhard answered honestly. "We didn't choose to come here. But now that we have, I see no reason to pretend we exist in a vacuum. My fleet needs resources, repair facilities, strategic information about this galaxy. Your empire presumably has all three. The question is whether we negotiate as equals or as rivals." Palpatine's laugh was dry as desert wind. "Equals. You command 23,000 ships. I command 1,000,000 worlds. We are not equals, young Admiral. We are sovereign and subject, emperor and petitioner." "Then we are rivals," Reinhard said flatly. "Because I have never been anyone's subject, and I never will be." The temperature in the throne room dropped. Vader's hand moved fractionally toward his lightsaber. But Palpatine raised one withered hand, staying his apprentice's motion. "Fascinating," the Emperor mused. "You stand before the most powerful being in the galaxy, command a fraction of the military force at my disposal, and yet you negotiate from a position of strength. Either you are supremely confident or supremely foolish." "I am a realist," Reinhard countered. "Your empire is vast, yes. But it's also overstretched. You have rebels insurgents operating across dozens of sectors. Your supply lines are vulnerable. Your fleet doctrine relies on intimidation rather than strategic efficiency. And most critically, you face internal dissent. Your Senate was dissolved recently, which suggests political instability you're attempting to suppress through force." Palpatine's eyes narrowed. "You've learned much in a very short time. I am a student of military history and political science, Emperor. Empires follow predictable patterns, regardless of which galaxy they inhabit." Reinhard allowed himself a slight smile. "You rule through fear. The Death Star, your planet-destroying battle station, was the ultimate expression of that philosophy. And then it was destroyed by a handful of rebel pilots, proving that your strategy has fundamental weaknesses." For a long moment, silence filled the throne room. When Palpatine spoke again, his voice carried genuine interest rather than mockery. "Lord Vader warned me you were arrogant. He failed to mention you were also correct." The Emperor stood slowly, revealing a frame bent by age but radiating authority nonetheless. "Very well, Admiral. You wish to negotiate as equals. Then hear my offer, integrate your fleet into Imperial command structure. Accept the rank of Grand Admiral, a position I have not granted in years. You will retain operational autonomy, command your forces as you see fit, and receive all resources necessary to maintain your fleet at peak efficiency. In exchange, you will use that strategic genius Lord Vader so begrudgingly acknowledged to crush the rebellion once and for all." "And my government?" Reinhard asked. "The Galactic Empire I represent exists in a galaxy you can no longer reach," Palpatine said bluntly. "Whatever political loyalties bound you there are irrelevant here. You command soldiers who need food, fuel, and purpose. I offer all three. Refuse, and you condemn them to slow starvation as resources dwindle and this galaxy's powers unite against the unknown threat you represent." It was, Reinhard had to admit, a masterful negotiating position. Palpatine had accurately identified the one thing Reinhard couldn't solve through tactical genius, the simple logistical reality that his fleet couldn't sustain itself indefinitely without supply infrastructure. "I have a counterproposal," Reinhard said carefully. Grant my fleet autonomous status as an allied force rather than an integrated command. We will assist Imperial operations against the rebellion, yes, but we retain our own command structure, our own strategic independence, and the right to refuse orders we find strategically unsound. You wish to be a mercenary, Palpatine observed. I wish to be a partner. There is a difference. Palpatine returned to his throne, steepling his fingers in a gesture that reminded Reinhard uncomfortably of Oberstein. And what of your rival? This young Wen-li, who even now negotiates with rebel agents. Will your partnership extend to eliminating him? Reinhard felt something cold settle in his chest. Yang was talking to the rebellion. Of course he was. It aligned perfectly with his democratic ideals and his pathological need to defend the weak against the strong. Which meant that this galaxy's war was about to become very familiar. Reinhard and Yang, commanding opposing fleets, locked in strategic combat across an unfamiliar battlefield. Admiral Yang and I have a complicated history, Reinhard said slowly. We are rivals, yes. Enemies in war. But we are also men of honor who understand the difference between legitimate military conflict and murder. If he allies with your rebellion, then yes, I will oppose him strategically. But I will do so on battlefields, with fleets and tactics, not through assassination or underhanded treachery. How disappointingly noble, Palpatine said, though his tone suggested he was more amused than disappointed. Very well, Admiral Lohengramm. I accept your counterproposal, for now. You will operate as an autonomous allied force under Imperial coordination. Lord Vader will serve as your liaison to ensure our strategic objectives align. And in your first demonstration of this partnership, you will eliminate the rebel base currently harboring your rival. Admiral Yang's position is known. We have traced rebel communications to a system in the Outer Rim, Vader interjected. Our intelligence indicates Yang Wen-li's fleet has made contact with Alliance leadership. They plan a joint operation to strike Imperial shipyards at Fonder within the month. Destroy the rebel fleet before this alliance can materialize, and you prove your value to the Empire. Reinhard considered the tactical implications. A preemptive strike against Yang's position before he could fully integrate with rebel forces. It was textbook strategic doctrine, eliminating enemy capability before it could be brought to bear. And yet something about the situation felt wrong, like a chess position that seemed advantageous but concealed a deeper trap. I'll need complete intelligence on the rebel position, Reinhard said finally. Fleet dispositions, defensive capabilities, local stellar geography. And I'll plan the operation myself, without Imperial tactical oversight. Of course, Palpatine agreed smoothly. I wouldn't dream of constraining your genius, Admiral. After all, I'm hiring you precisely because your strategic methods differ from conventional Imperial doctrine. His smile widened. Show me why the legend of the Galactic Heroes is worth the resources I'm investing in keeping your fleet operational. Reinhard bowed slightly, acknowledgement of a temporary alliance, not submission, and turned to leave. As he walked toward the throne room doors, Palpatine's voice followed him one last time. One more thing, Admiral. Your rival, this young Wen-li. Is he truly your equal in strategic capability? Reinhard paused, considering his answer carefully. No, Emperor. He's not my equal. Then crushing him should present no difficulty. You misunderstand, Reinhard said quietly, looking back over his shoulder. Young Wen-li is not my equal because what I accomplish through strength of will and tactical brilliance, he accomplishes through understanding human nature and accepting limitations. He wins battles by making opponents defeat themselves. And that makes him more dangerous than any strategist I've ever faced. He left the throne room with those words hanging in the air, knowing he had just warned the Emperor about the one man in either galaxy who could threaten both their ambitions. In the Hyperion's war room, young Wen-li stood before a holographic display of the Star Wars galaxy with the expression of a man trying to solve a historical puzzle with insufficient data. Around him, his senior staff had been joined by Rebel Alliance leadership, Mon Mothma, Admiral Akbar, and General Dodonna, all studying the same display with varying expressions of hope and concern. Your fleet doctrine is fundamentally flawed, Yang said without preamble, gesturing to the holographic representations of rebel capital ships. You're using guerrilla tactics with conventional military forces, which creates a strategic contradiction that your enemy exploits ruthlessly. Mon Mothma, dignified even in the cramped confines of a warship, inclined her head slightly. Admiral Yang, we employ guerrilla tactics because we lack the resources for conventional engagement. The Empire outnumbers us. By a factor that makes conventional engagement suicide, yes, I understand. Yang took a sip of tea, his 10th cup in the past 4 hours. But you're not fully committing to guerrilla doctrine either. You maintain a centralized fleet, you plan large-scale operations, you try to hold territory. These are all conventional military objectives that require conventional military strength you don't possess. What would you recommend? Admiral Akbar asked, his Mon Calamari features betraying keen interest despite obvious skepticism. Yang turned to the display, highlighting several systems in the outer and mid-rim. Complete strategic dispersal. Break your fleet into autonomous cells, nothing larger than 3 capital ships per group. Abandon any pretense of holding territory. Instead, focus exclusively on disrupting Imperial supply lines, targeting isolated facilities, and creating the impression of being everywhere simultaneously while actually being nowhere in particular. That's not fighting a war, General Dodonna objected. That's harassment. Exactly. Yang smiled tiredly. Empires don't fall to direct military confrontation when the empire has overwhelming force advantage. They fall when the cost of maintaining control exceeds the benefit of conquered territory. Make this empire spend resources protecting every system, guarding every supply convoy, securing every minor outpost. Death by 1,000 cuts. And what of your fleet? Mon Mothma asked carefully. 8,000 capital ships would seem to suggest you favor conventional engagement. My fleet is a strategic asset that changes the entire calculation, Yang admitted. But not in the way you're hoping. I won't commit to direct fleet-to-fleet engagement with Imperial forces because I'd lose. They have superior numbers, better logistical support, and something called the Force that I still don't fully understand. What I can do is serve as a fleet in being. Explain, Akbar requested. Yang highlighted the Hyperion's current position. The simple fact that my fleet exists and the Empire doesn't know where I'll strike next forces them to hold forces in reserve, reinforce vulnerable positions, and generally behave defensively despite offensive superiority. I don't actually have to fight, I just have to make them think I might fight, which ties down Imperial resources without risking my ships. A psychological operation, Dodonna mused. Using strategic ambiguity as a weapon. Precisely. Yang finished his tea. And when I do strike, it will be at targets that maximize political impact while minimizing military risk. Not battle stations or fleet concentrations, infrastructure, logistics, symbolic targets that the Empire can't afford to lose. Mon Mothma studied Yang with the calculating gaze of a politician who had survived years of Imperial oppression through careful maneuvering. You're describing a long war, Admiral. Years, possibly decades of slow strangulation rather than decisive victory. I'm describing the only war you can win, Yang corrected gently. Decisive victory requires military parity you'll never achieve. But economic exhaustion? Political collapse? Those are victories that don't require you to outfight the Empire, just outlast it. And Reinhard von Lohengramm? Frederica interjected. Admiral, we've received intelligence that he's meeting with Emperor Palpatine personally. If he allies with Imperial forces, then we face exactly the situation I faced back home, Yang interrupted quietly. A brilliant, aggressive strategist commanding superior forces against my defensive doctrine. The only difference is that here, Reinhard doesn't have political constraints limiting his actions. He'll be free to pursue total victory with the full backing of Imperial logistics. The war room fell silent. Finally, Mon Mothma spoke, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that would shape galactic history. Admiral Yang, if we follow your strategic recommendations, we're committing the Alliance to a fundamentally different kind of war than we've been fighting. Many of our commanders won't accept defensive doctrine. Many of our cells operate independently precisely because they reject centralized authority. Then you'll lose, Yang said bluntly. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly and inevitably. Because Reinhard von Lohengramm doesn't make mistakes, doesn't leave openings, and doesn't stop until victory is absolute. The only way to fight him is to refuse to fight him, to deny him the decisive battle he wants while slowly eroding his strategic position. You fought him before, Akbar observed. And survived. I've fought him dozens of times, Yang confirmed. Won some, lost more. But I'm still here, which means something. He looked around the room at faces marked by years of desperate struggle. I can't promise you victory. I can't even promise you survival. But I can promise you this, if you're willing to fight the war you can win instead of the war you want to fight, I'll show you how to make an empire bleed. Mon Mothma extended her hand. Then welcome to the rebellion, Admiral Yang Wen-li, may your strategic genius prove equal to the challenge ahead. Yang shook her hand, feeling the familiar weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders once again. Somewhere in this galaxy, Reinhard was planning his opening move. And somewhere in the force's flowing currents that Yang couldn't sense or understand, the Emperor was calculating how to turn two legendary commanders against each other for his own benefit. The legend of the Galactic Heroes had entered the Galactic Civil War. And nothing in either galaxy would ever be the same. The strategic briefing aboard the Brunhild resembled a surgical procedure more than a military planning session. Reinhard stood at the center of a three-dimensional holographic projection of the Anoat sector, his senior admirals arrayed around him in a perfect circle, each studying the tactical data with the practiced efficiency of officers who had learned to anticipate their commander's thoughts. The rebel base is here, Oberstein said, highlighting a small moon orbiting a gas giant in an otherwise unremarkable system. Intelligence provided by Imperial sources indicates Yang Wen-li's fleet has established position in high orbit, with rebel capital ships integrated into defensive formations. Estimated defensive strength, 8,000 Alliance vessels plus approximately 40 rebel capital ships and supporting fighter screens. Fighter screens, Mittermeier repeated, studying the tiny icons representing single-pilot craft. Admiral, I still don't understand this galaxy's tactical doctrine. Fighters can't possibly threaten capital ships, they lack the firepower, the armor, and the endurance for sustained engagement. Which means we're missing something, Reinhard said quietly, zooming in on the fighter formations. This galaxy's military forces aren't incompetent, primitive by our standards, yes, but not suicidal. If they deploy fighters as primary strike assets, there must be a tactical reason. He turned to Oberstein. What did Imperial intelligence reveal about fighter capabilities? Very little concrete data, Oberstein admitted. However, there are references to something called proton torpedoes, high-yield warheads apparently capable of penetrating capital ship shields and causing catastrophic damage. The Death Star itself was destroyed by a single fighter carrying such weapons striking a thermal exhaust port. The room fell silent. Every officer present understood the implications. If fighter-scale weapons could destroy a battle station the size of a moon, then their own capital ships, for all their superior armor and firepower, might be vulnerable in ways they hadn't anticipated. We adapt, Reinhard decided. Standard fleet doctrine assumes fighters are negligible threats. Here, we treat them as capital ship equivalents for targeting priority. All-point defense systems focus on eliminating fighter screens before engaging larger vessels. He studied the holographic display, his mind racing through tactical permutations. What's the local stellar geography? The system contains a dense asteroid field between the 4th and 5th orbital positions, Muller reported. The gas giant where Yang has established position sits at the 6th orbital, with two smaller rocky moons in addition to the one hosting rebel facilities. Reinhard's eyes gleamed. An asteroid field meant sensor interference, navigational hazards, and opportunities for unconventional approach vectors. Yang would know that, of course, the magician never chose defensive positions randomly. Which meant the obvious approaches were probably trapped, and the difficult approaches were where Yang expected him to commit. "He's baiting me," Reinhard murmured. "Yang knows I favor aggressive tactics and decisive engagement. He's positioned himself in terrain that favors defensive operations, daring me to attack into prepared positions." "Then we don't attack," Oberstein suggested. "We blockade the system, cut off supplies, and force Yang to either starve or break out through our fleet. Siege warfare negates his defensive advantages. It also gives him time," Reinhard countered. "Time to integrate fully with rebel forces, time to study our capabilities, time to plan countermeasures. Yang Wen-li with time to think is more dangerous than Yang Wen-li forced to react." He straightened, decision crystallizing. "We attack, but not directly. Oberstein, what other Imperial targets exist within striking distance of Yang's position?" Oberstein consulted his data. "Imperial Logistics Depot at Hoth System, 3 parsecs distant. Minor garrison force, but significant fuel and ammunition reserves. Also, Imperial Communications Relay on Ord Mantell, 5 parsecs, critical for coordinating sector fleet movements." "Perfect." Reinhard's smile was sharp. "We strike Ord Mantell with a fast raiding force, 3,000 ships, maximum speed, hit the relay station and withdraw before Imperial reinforcements arrive. Yang will detect the operation and face a choice: remain in position and let us operate freely, or commit his fleet to intercept, abandoning his defensive advantages." "And if he remains in position?" Mittermeier asked. "Then we've demonstrated to our Imperial allies that we're actively contributing to their war effort while also proving Yang won't defend rebel strategic assets." Reinhard gestured at the holographic display. "But Yang won't stay put. He can't. His entire strategic philosophy revolves around minimizing losses and protecting the weak. A raid on an Imperial installation means civilian casualties, collateral damage, the kind of acceptable losses Yang finds morally intolerable. You're using his ethics against him," Oberstein observed neutrally. "I'm using everything against him," Reinhard replied. "As he would against me. The difference is that Yang's principles limit his options while mine expand them." He turned to his fleet commanders. "Admiral Mittermeier, you'll lead the Ord Mantell operation. Fast in, maximum destruction, fast out. Don't engage if Yang's fleet appears. Your objective is to force him into motion, not to fight a battle we haven't chosen." "Understood, Admiral. The rest of the fleet will take up position here." Reinhard highlighted a point between Ord Mantell and Yang's current location, where we can intercept if Yang commits to defending the relay station, or pivot to blockade if he remains static. Either way, we seize the initiative and force him to react to our strategic tempo rather than dictating his own. It was elegant, efficient, and entirely in character for Reinhard von Lohengramm, a strategy that turned Yang's greatest strengths, defensive positioning and moral conviction, into exploitable weaknesses. Around the holographic display, his admirals nodded in understanding and appreciation. "When do we begin?" Muller asked. Reinhard's smile widened. "Immediately. Yang thinks he has time to prepare. Let's teach him that in this galaxy, against this enemy, preparation is a luxury he no longer possesses." Yang Wen-li discovered Reinhard's opening move exactly as Reinhard had intended, through panicked rebel transmissions reporting an Imperial fleet emerging from hyperspace at Ord Mantell with clear hostile intent. By the time the Hyperion's sensors confirmed the tactical situation, Mittermeier's raiders were already engaging the communications relay's defensive platforms. 3,000 ships, Frederica reported, studying the tactical feed with growing alarm. Standard Imperial-class vessels based on configuration, but energy signatures matched the unknown fleet that arrived with Admiral Lohengramm. "Admiral, this is Reinhard's opening move. Yang sat in his command chair, tea forgotten, studying the holographic display with the intense focus he reserved for facing his greatest rival. Force composition. Heavy on battleships and cruisers, minimal support vessels. Fast assault configuration prioritizing firepower over endurance. They're not planning to hold the system, this is a raid. Targeting? Yang asked, though he already suspected the answer. The communications relay exclusively. They're ignoring the garrison forces, civilian infrastructure, everything except the relay itself. Frederica looked up from her screens. Admiral, if that relay falls, Imperial coordination across 3 sectors becomes significantly degraded. The rebellion has been trying to take it offline for months. And now Reinhard is doing it for us, Yang murmured. Which means this isn't really an attack on Imperial infrastructure. It's an attack on me. He stood, pacing the bridge with his hands clasped behind his back. He knows I can't ignore this. A communications relay isn't a military target in the traditional sense, it's a civilian installation staffed by technicians and engineers. Reinhard's tactics will be characteristically brutal, overwhelming firepower, maximum efficiency, acceptable collateral damage. He's daring me to intervene or live with the consequences of inaction. Then we intervene, said Admiral Merkatz, one of Yang's senior commanders who had defected from the Galactic Empire's navy back home. We have numerical superiority if we commit the full fleet. 3,000 ships against 8,000 is a decisive advantage. It's a trap, Yang countered. Reinhard wouldn't commit 1/5 of his fleet to a raid without covering the tactical contingency of our intervention. Where's the rest of his force? Frederica worked her console, pulling long-range sensor data. Unknown, Admiral. We're detecting gravitational anomalies consistent with large fleet formations holding position in nearby systems, but the specific coordinates are unclear. This galaxy's sensor technology isn't as precise as ours, they rely heavily on something called hyperspace vectors that our equipment can't properly interpret. Yang closed his eyes, visualizing the tactical situation as if it were a historical battle he was analyzing centuries after the fact. Reinhard had always favored aggressive warfare, but he was never reckless. The raid on Ord Mantell served multiple purposes: probe Yang's defensive commitment, force him to abandon his prepared position, demonstrate capability to Imperial allies, and most importantly, seize the initiative. If I stay here, Reinhard continues raiding operations across the sector while we sit idle, Yang said slowly, working through the strategic logic. Our alliance with the rebellion becomes worthless if we won't defend rebel interests. But if I commit the full fleet to intercept, I abandon this position and potentially walk into a fleet engagement on Reinhard's terms. He opened his eyes. There's a third option. Admiral? Frederica prompted. We split our force. Lieutenant Greenhill, I want 4,000 ships, our fastest cruisers and destroyers, prepared for immediate hyperspace jump to Ord Mantell. We arrive, engage Reinhard's raiders, force them to withdraw or face overwhelming numbers. But we don't pursue beyond the immediate tactical space, and we maintain constant readiness to disengage. And the other 4,000 ships? Merkatz asked. Remain here in defensive formation, prepared for Reinhard's main fleet to attack once I've divided our forces. Yang smiled grimly. Because that's what I would do if I were him, bait the enemy into dividing their strength, then crush the isolated portions sequentially. The difference is, Reinhard expects me to either commit fully or not at all. Splitting forces is conventionally considered a strategic error, which means it's exactly the kind of unconventional move he won't anticipate. Around the bridge, his officers exchanged uncertain glances. Dividing forces in the face of a numerically superior enemy violated every principle of conventional military doctrine. But then, young Wen-li had built his reputation on winning battles by doing precisely what conventional doctrine claimed was impossible. Prepare the fleet for division, Yang ordered. Admiral Merkatz, you'll command defensive operations here. I'll personally lead the Ord Mantell intervention. And someone please brew fresh tea, this is going to be a long engagement. The Imperial communications relay at Ord Mantell died exactly as Mittermeier had planned, 3,000 battleships emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation, axial main cannons firing in devastating synchronized volleys that overwhelmed defensive shields in the first 30 seconds. The relay station's structural integrity failed completely within 2 minutes, its massive antenna arrays tumbling through space as secondary explosions ripped through power infrastructure. Target destroyed, Mittermeier's tactical officer reported with satisfaction. Garrison forces are attempting to regroup, but they lack the firepower to threaten us. We have complete tactical superiority. Mittermeier nodded, but his expression remained tense. Admiral Lohengramm had been explicit: destroy the target and withdraw immediately, don't linger, don't engage beyond the primary objective. Which meant Yang Wen-li's response was anticipated and dangerous. Sensors, what's our hyperspace signatures? The sensor officer shouted. Multiple contacts, 4,000 plus, emerging at extreme engagement range. The holographic display populated with icons representing Yang's fleet, not the full 8,000 ships Mittermeier had expected, but enough to turn this raid into a genuine battle if he chose to stand and fight. And the formation was perfect. Yang had emerged at maximum weapons range, positioned to cut off retreat vectors while maintaining distance that negated Mittermeier's advantage in close-quarters firepower. The magician, Mittermeier muttered appreciatively. He split his force. He turned to his communications officer. Transmit to Admiral Lohengramm, Yang has committed 4,000 ships to Ord Mantell defense. He's maintained 4,000 in reserve at his primary position. Tactical situation is as anticipated, recommend immediate execution of secondary phase. Receiving response from the Admiral, the communications officer reported moments later. We're to withdraw immediately. Do not engage Yang's fleet under any circumstances. Mittermeier felt the familiar frustration of obeying orders that went against tactical instinct. 4,000 against 3,000 were poor odds, yes, but not impossible, and his ships were individually superior in firepower and armor. But he had learned long ago that Reinhard von Lohengramm's strategic vision extended beyond individual battles. All ships, prepare for hyperspace withdrawal, Mittermeier commanded. Jump on my mark, scatter pattern Delta 7, rendezvous at predetermined coordinates. Execute. The Imperial fleet vanished into hyperspace mere seconds before Yang's advance elements could close to effective weapons range, leaving the burning wreckage of the communications relay as the only evidence of their presence. Aboard the Hyperion, Yang watched Mittermeier's fleet escape with the resigned expression of a man who had anticipated exactly this outcome. They're not engaging, Frederica reported. Clean withdrawal, no pursuit possible given their head start. Of course they're not engaging, Yang said quietly. Reinhard accomplished his objective, destroyed the relay, forced me to divide my forces, and now knows exactly how I respond to tactical pressure. He's not interested in a battle he didn't fully plan. Yang turned to his navigation officer. How long until we can return to our defensive position? 4 hours at maximum hyperspace speed, Admiral. 4 hours. Yang closed his eyes, calculating time and distance and the tactical possibilities that opened during that window. Reinhard now knew the defensive position was held by only 4,000 ships instead of 8,000. 4 hours was more than enough time to organize an assault on a weakened position, especially for a commander who specialized in lightning warfare. He's going to hit Admiral Merkatz, Yang said with absolute certainty. That was the entire point of this operation, not to destroy a communications relay, but to create a 4-hour window where my defensive position is vulnerable. We need to. Admiral, the communications officer interrupted, voice tight with urgency. Receiving emergency transmission from our defensive fleet. They're under attack. 12,000 Imperial ships just emerged from hyperspace at close range. Admiral Merkatz is requesting immediate reinforcement. The bridge fell silent. 12,000 ships, Reinhard had committed nearly his entire fleet to this assault, holding back only enough forces to maintain operational reserves. And he had timed it perfectly, arriving at the exact moment Yang's fleet was 4 hours away, unable to influence the battle. "It's beautiful," Yang whispered, a historian's appreciation warring with a commander's horror. "He baited me with a raid, forced me to respond with exactly half my fleet, then struck the weakened position with overwhelming force during the 4-hour window when I couldn't reinforce. It's textbook strategic exploitation of temporal and spatial advantage." "Admiral, orders." Frederica's voice carried barely controlled panic. "Meerkats can't hold against 12,000 ships." Yang stood motionless for a long moment, his mind racing through tactical options that all led to the same conclusion: he had been outmaneuvered. Reinhard had seized the initiative, dictated the tempo of operations, and forced Yang into a position where every choice led to disadvantage. Return to defend Meerkats and potentially walk into a second ambush? Remain at Ord Mantell and abandon 4,000 ships to destruction? We return immediately, Yang decided. Maximum speed, combat readiness on arrival. And transmit to Admiral Meerkats, hold for 4 hours. Employ every defensive tactic we've ever used. Make Reinhard pay for every meter of space he takes. As the Hyperion prepared for emergency hyperspace transit, Yang allowed himself one quiet moment of acknowledgement. He had faced Reinhard von Lohengramm in dozens of battles across their home galaxy. He had won some through cleverness and desperation and luck. But this was Reinhard at his most dangerous, unleashed from political constraint, commanding a fleet with superior technology, supported by an empire's logistics, and motivated by the pure ambition that made him legend. The Battle of Ord Mantell had been lost before it even began. And Yang suspected that in this new galaxy, against this impossible enemy, he would lose many more battles before the war's end. The Battle of the Anoat sector began precisely as Reinhard had calculated, 12,000 ships emerging from hyperspace in a crescent formation that immediately seized high-energy orbital positions around the moon where Yang's remaining 4,000 vessels maintained defensive perimeter. Admiral Meerkats, commanding from his flagship Iserlohn, recognized the tactical catastrophe within seconds of sensor contact. Fleet dispersal. Meerkats ordered, his gravelly voice cutting through bridge chaos. All ships implement Defensive Protocol 7, scatter formation, maximum evasive, deny them concentrated targets. The Alliance fleet fractured into hundreds of smaller elements, each ship or small group maneuvering independently to create a defensive zone that prevented Reinhardt's forces from achieving decisive engagement. It was brilliant desperation, trading cohesive fleet strength for survivability, accepting that 4,000 ships couldn't defeat 12,000 but could potentially delay them long enough for Yang's relief force to arrive. Reinhard observed this maneuver from the Brunhild's command bridge with the cool analytical gaze of a grandmaster studying an opponent's defensive response. Meerkats, he said quietly, noting the flagship's tactical signature. One of Yang's senior commanders. Competent, experienced, but predictable. He turned to Oberstein. They're buying time. How long until Yang can return from Ord Mantell? Approximately 3 hours and 42 minutes, Admiral, assuming maximum hyperspace velocity. Then we have 3 hours to break their defensive perimeter and secure orbital superiority. Reinhard gestured at the holographic display. Target priority, eliminate their heaviest capital ships first. Don't pursue scattered elements, focus firepower on ships that can threaten our fleet integrity. Use cephal particles to disrupt their communications and coordination. Deploying cephal particle dispersal, his tactical officer confirmed. Across the battle space, Reinhardt's ships released clouds of specialized particles that interfered with electromagnetic sensors and communications, a strategic weapon unique to his home galaxy's military technology. Within minutes, Meerkats' carefully coordinated defense began fragmenting as individual ships lost real-time communication with their command structure. They're adapting, Oberstein noted, studying sensor returns. Switching to prearranged tactical protocols instead of dynamic coordination. Meerkats anticipated communication disruption. Of course he did, Reinhard acknowledged. Yang trains his commanders well. But prearranged protocols can't match dynamic tactical response. Begin assault pattern Omega, concentrated firepower waves, overwhelming individual defensive positions sequentially. The Imperial fleet reorganized into hammer formations, concentrated groups of 500 ships focusing their axial main cannons on single alliance vessels, destroying them with overwhelming firepower before shifting to the next target. It was brutally efficient, sacrificing tactical elegance for raw destructive output. One by one, Yang's capital ships died, fusion cores detonating in silent explosions that briefly outshone the system's distant star. Merkatz watched his fleet die with the grim resignation of a man who understood mathematics couldn't be defeated through courage alone. All ships, fall back to the moon's gravity well. Use planetary mass as cover, force them to fight in close quarters where our maneuverability advantage matters. It was the right tactical decision, but Reinhard had anticipated it. They're retreating to terrain advantage. Admiral Muller, take 3,000 ships and flank around the moon's far side. Catch them in crossfire when they think they've achieved defensive position. The battle evolved into a three-dimensional chess match fought across orbital mechanics and gravitational fields. Merkatz's forces used the moon's mass to shield themselves from direct fire, emerging only to launch hit-and-run attacks before retreating behind planetary cover. But Muller's flanking force closed the trap, eliminating the safe zones and forcing alliance ships into open space where Reinhard's numerical superiority became overwhelming. Admiral, Merkatz's communications officer reported, voice tight with suppressed fear, we've lost 40% of fleet strength. Enemy casualties are negligible, maybe 300 ships damaged, none destroyed. We can't hold for 3 more hours. Merkatz studied the tactical display with the calm that came from facing death countless times. He had served under Yang Wen-li for a decade, had learned from the magician's unconventional wisdom, had internalized the fundamental principle that defined Yang's strategic philosophy: victory wasn't always possible, but you could always choose how you lost. Prepare the civilian evacuation fleet for emergency departure, Merkatz ordered quietly. All remaining military vessels will execute final defensive protocol. We hold this position, we die in this position, but we buy every second we can for those transports to escape. Yang Wen-li's fleet emerged from hyperspace at maximum combat velocity, 4,000 ships dropping into real space with weapons hot and sensors sweeping for tactical positioning. What they found made even Yang's carefully maintained composure crack. The Anoat sector moon was surrounded by a debris field that had been, 4 hours ago, a coordinated defensive fleet. Merkatz's 4,000 ships had been reduced to fewer than 800 battered survivors, clustered in a desperate final defensive formation around a cluster of transport vessels attempting to escape the gravity well. And encircling them like predators toying with wounded prey, Reinhard's 12,000 ships maintained perfect firing positions, weapons locked but holding fire. They're waiting, Frederica whispered. Reinhard is waiting for us. Yang understood immediately. This wasn't a battle anymore, it was a message. Reinhard could have destroyed Merkatz's final formation an hour ago, could have eliminated the transports with trivial effort. Instead, he had preserved them specifically for this moment, creating a tactical scenario with only 2 possible responses. Yang could commit his 4,000 ships to a desperate rescue attempt, fighting 12,000 vessels in a battle he couldn't win, or he could withdraw and abandon 800 comrades and thousands of civilians to certain death. It was perfect strategic cruelty, the kind of choice that defined not just tactical capability but moral character. Open a communication channel, Yang said quietly. Direct line to the Brunhild. I need to speak with Reinhard. The view screen flickered to life, revealing the command bridge of Reinhard's flagship. And there stood his rival, golden-haired, ice-eyed, 27 years old and already legendary, studying Yang with an expression that mixed respect and absolute certainty of victory. Admiral Yang, Reinhard said, his voice carrying across the void between their ships. How efficient of you to arrive precisely when the tactical situation becomes interesting. Reinhard. Yang's tone held none of his usual weary humor. You've won this engagement. You have superior forces, superior positioning, and complete tactical control. There's no strategic reason to destroy those transports beyond sending a message I've already received. Let them go. Let them go, Reinhard repeated, as if tasting the words. The fleet that remains is military, enemy combatants by any definition. The transports carry rebel personnel and resources. Why should I extend mercy to those who oppose the authority I've allied with? Because you're not a murderer, Yang said quietly. We've fought dozens of battles, Reinhard. I know you. You're ambitious, ruthless when tactics demand it, absolutely uncompromising in pursuit of victory. But you've never been cruel for cruelty's sake. You don't massacre defeated enemies or slaughter civilians to prove a point. Reinhard's expression flickered, something that might have been surprised that Yang would appeal to principles rather than pragmatism. You presume much about my character, Yang Wen-li. I presume based on a decade of studying you as both enemy and rival, Yang countered. And I'm asking, not as a military commander but as one human being to another, let those people live. They can't threaten you. They can't change the tactical situation. They're only alive because you chose to keep them that way as leverage against me. Which means their deaths would serve no purpose beyond proving you're willing to kill to make strategic points. For a long moment, Reinhard said nothing. Around him, his bridge crew watched in silence, waiting for their commander's decision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a strange mixture of respect and regret. You're correct, of course. Destroying transports full of defeated personnel serves no military purpose. He turned to his tactical officer. Stand down weapons. Allow the transport vessels to depart the system unmolested. Admiral. Oberstein's cold voice interjected. We had agreed to demonstrate overwhelming force. Mercy communicates weakness. Mercy communicates confidence, Reinhard corrected. We've destroyed 3/4 of Yang's defensive fleet in under 4 hours. We've proven our tactical superiority beyond any doubt. Slaughtering defeated enemies would be petty vengeance, not strategic doctrine. He looked back at Yang's image. You have 1 hour to evacuate your survivors and depart this system. After that, we resume offensive operations and I will not be so generous. Understood, Yang said. Then, quietly, thank you, Reinhard. Don't thank me yet, Yang Wen-li. We're still enemies. The fact that I'll kill you honorably doesn't change that I intend to kill you. Reinhard's smile was sharp. And next time, I won't give you the opportunity to evacuate at all. The communication cut off, leaving Yang staring at an empty view screen while his bridge crew worked frantically to coordinate evacuation of Mercat's survivors. Admiral, Frederica said carefully, that could have gone much worse. It went exactly as Reinhard intended, Yang replied. He demonstrated overwhelming tactical superiority, forced me to abandon a defensive position I spent weeks preparing, destroyed half my fleet, and still managed to appear magnanimous by sparing transports he could have obliterated. And in return, all he sacrificed was less than 500 ships damaged and maybe 30 destroyed. He rubbed his temples. I've been outmaneuvered, outfought, and psychologically outmatched in a single engagement. So what do we do now? Admiral Mercatz asked, his image appearing on a secondary screen from his battered flagship. Yang was silent for a long moment, watching through the view screen as transport vessels began their escape trajectory, carrying thousands of lives that existed only because he had asked and Reinhard had chosen mercy. It was a debt he would remember, even as he planned how to repay it with strategic victory rather than gratitude. Now, Yang said finally, we acknowledge that conventional military engagement against Reinhard von Lohengramm is suicide. We can't match his tactical genius, we can't overcome his numerical advantage, and we can't predict his strategic choices accurately enough to prepare proper countermeasures. He turned to his assembled officers. Which means we stop trying to fight Reinhard on his terms and start creating situations where his strengths become irrelevant. Guerrilla warfare, Mercat said, understanding dawning. You're abandoning conventional fleet operations entirely. I'm accepting reality, Yang corrected. Reinhard is better at fleet-to-fleet combat than I am. He always has been. But he's not better at asymmetric warfare, political maneuvering, or strategic patience. So we'll fight that war instead, the one where his 12,000 ships can't be everywhere simultaneously, where his tactical genius matters less than our ability to disappear and strike from unexpected angles. The rebellion has been fighting that war for years, Frederica pointed out. With limited success. Because they've been fighting it without proper strategic coordination and with a fleet commander who understands how asymmetric warfare is supposed to work. Yang pulled up a galactic map, highlighting dozens of systems across the outer and mid-rim. We're going to teach this rebellion how to win a war they can't win. And we're going to do it by making Reinhard's greatest strength, his ability to win decisive battles, completely irrelevant. It was classic Yang Wen-li logic. When you couldn't win the game being played, you changed the game entirely. And if that meant transforming from a fleet admiral commanding 8,000 ships into a guerrilla coordinator managing distributed cells across a galaxy, then so be it. Somewhere in the debris field surrounding the Anoat moon, Reinhard von Lohengramm stood on the bridge of the Brunhild, watching Yang's fleet execute its carefully organized retreat. He had won the battle decisively, proven his superiority completely, and yet something about Yang's tactical withdrawal suggested this was exactly the response the magician had anticipated, perhaps even desired. He's planning something, Reinhard murmured. Admiral? Mittermeier prompted. Yang doesn't retreat because he's beaten. He retreats because conventional engagement no longer serves his strategic objectives. Reinhard studied the tactical display with growing certainty. He's going to abandon fleet-scale operations entirely. Guerrilla warfare, hit and run, strategic dispersal, all the tactics that make our numerical superiority irrelevant. Then we pursue, Oberstein suggested. Destroy his fleet while it's vulnerable, eliminate the threat before he can implement whatever strategy he's planning. Reinhard shook his head slowly. No. Yang is too intelligent to make his fleet vulnerable during retreat. He'll have contingencies, fallback positions, sacrificial elements to buy time if we pursue. And more importantly, Emperor Palpatine hired us to defeat the rebellion, not to chase Yang Wen-li across the galaxy in an endless game of tactical maneuvering. So we let him go? Mittermeier asked, frustrated. We let him go, Reinhard confirmed, because we've achieved our strategic objective, proven to the Empire that our fleet is worth the resources they're investing, demonstrated clear superiority over Yang's forces, and forced him to abandon conventional military doctrine. What comes next will be different, a war of intelligence, logistics, and strategic patience rather than tactical brilliance. His smile turned predatory. And Yang may believe asymmetric warfare negates our advantages. He's about to learn that genius finds a way to win regardless of which game is being played. The Imperial fleet began organizing for departure, leaving the Anoat sector as a graveyard of shattered ships and failed strategies. Behind them, Yang's forces vanished into hyperspace, carrying survivors, and the grim knowledge that conventional warfare against the legend of the Galactic Heroes was a losing proposition. The Galactic Civil War had just become exponentially more complicated. And in his throne room on Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine sensed through the Force that his careful plans to set two legendary commanders against each other had succeeded even beyond his considerable expectations. The pieces were moving exactly as he desired. And when the time came, he would ensure both legends destroyed each other, leaving him the sole power in a galaxy that had forgotten what freedom looked like. The Executor hung in orbit above Coruscant like a dagger pointed at the galaxy's heart, its massive wedge shape casting shadows across the planet's cityscape that stretched from pole to pole. Darth Vader stood in the observation deck, hands clasped behind his back, studying tactical reports from the Anoat sector engagement with the cold analytical focus that had made him the Emperor's most effective enforcer. Behind him, Reinhard von Lohengramm entered without announcement, his posture carrying the absolute confidence of a man who had just achieved decisive military victory. The two regarded each other, one a dark lord whose power flowed through mystical energies incomprehensible to conventional science, the other a strategic genius who had conquered an empire through intellect alone. Admiral Lohengramm, Vader said, his breathing apparatus filling the silence. Your victory at Anoat was impressive. 3,000 enemy capital ships destroyed, their defensive position eliminated, and Wen-li forced into full retreat. The Emperor is pleased. I'm gratified, Reinhard replied, though his tone suggested he cared very little for Palpatine's approval. However, I suspect you didn't summon me to deliver compliments. What does the Emperor require? Vader turned from the viewport, his mask's empty lenses fixing on Reinhard with unsettling intensity. Your tactical assessment of Wen-li, Imperial intelligence suggests he's abandoned conventional fleet operations and dispersed his forces across 24 systems. Your analysis. Reinhard moved to stand beside Vader, looking down at the planet below. Yang is adapting to strategic realities. He can't defeat my fleet in direct engagement, so he's implementing asymmetric warfare doctrine, distributed forces, hit-and-run tactics, targeting logistics rather than military assets. It's textbook guerrilla strategy for a numerically inferior force. Can it succeed? Against conventional Imperial forces? Absolutely. Reinhard's assessment was brutally honest. Your Empire's military doctrine relies on overwhelming firepower and fear-based compliance. Yang will exploit both weaknesses, dispersed targets negate firepower concentration, and guerrilla success erodes the fear that maintains your control. He'll make the cost of occupation exceed its benefit, sector by sector, until your empire bleeds resources maintaining territories that generate no strategic value. And against your forces? Vader pressed. Reinhard smiled coldly. That's more interesting. My fleet possesses superior technology and strategic mobility, but we're still bound by the same logistical limitations as any military force. We can't be everywhere simultaneously. Yang understands this. He'll avoid direct engagement entirely, striking targets we can't defend because we don't know where he'll appear next. He paused. It's infuriating, effective, and precisely what I would do in his position. The Emperor will not accept prolonged guerrilla warfare, Vader said flatly. He retained your services to end the rebellion quickly and decisively, not to manage an endless insurgency. Then the Emperor misunderstands the nature of warfare against intelligent opposition. Reinhard turned to face Vader directly. You don't end insurgencies through military force alone. You end them by eliminating the political conditions that sustain them or by making resistance so costly that populations abandon their cause. Your empire has attempted the latter for years with limited success. Perhaps it's time to consider the former. You propose negotiation with terrorists. Vader's tone carried dangerous edge. I propose understanding why your terrorists exist in the first place, Reinhard countered. The rebellion formed because your emperor dissolved a democratic senate, murdered an entire planet as demonstration of power, and rules through fear backed by supernatural abilities most beings in this galaxy can't comprehend. Those aren't conditions that generate loyalty, they generate the exact desperation that makes guerrilla warfare sustainable indefinitely. For a long moment, Vader simply stared at him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been grudging respect. You are remarkably candid for someone who serves at Imperial pleasure, Admiral. I don't serve at Imperial pleasure, Reinhard corrected. I serve according to negotiated terms that guarantee my fleet's autonomy and operational independence. If the Emperor finds my candor unacceptable, he's welcome to terminate our arrangement, at which point my 12,000 ships become a third faction in this war rather than his strategic asset. It was an extraordinarily dangerous statement to make to Darth Vader, a being who had killed subordinates for far less insolence. But Reinhard had calculated the political realities with his characteristic precision. The Empire needed his fleet to counter Yang's insurgency, and eliminating him would only create a larger strategic problem. Vader knew it. Palpatine knew it. And Reinhard knew they knew it, which gave him negotiating leverage even in the heart of Imperial power. The Emperor understands your value, Vader said after a measured silence. However, he requires results. Deliver Wen-li, dead, captured, or strategically neutralized, and your fleet will receive priority access to Imperial logistics infrastructure and shipyard facilities. Fail, and you may discover that necessity is not the same as indispensability. Understood, Reinhard acknowledged. And to achieve that objective, I'll need complete Imperial intelligence on rebel operations, cell locations, supply routes, suspected leadership positions, everything your intelligence apparatus has compiled. I can't hunt Yang without knowing where to look. You will have it. Vader gestured toward the viewport. But understand, Admiral, the Emperor's patience is not infinite. You have 3 months to demonstrate that your strategic genius justifies the resources invested in your fleet. After that, alternative methods will be considered. Reinhard nodded once, already calculating how to turn Imperial intelligence into strategic advantage against an opponent who specialized in being unpredictable. As he turned to leave, Vader's voice stopped him. One more thing, Admiral Lohengramm. This force you dismiss as supernatural mysticism. It allows me to sense intentions, predict actions, and influence minds through means your technology cannot measure or counter. You would be wise to remember that strategic genius, however impressive, can be negated by power that operates outside conventional rules. Reinhard looked back, his ice-blue eyes meeting Vader's masked gaze without flinching. And you would be wise to remember, Lord Vader, that every power has limitations, even yours. The fact that I can't sense or understand the Force doesn't make me vulnerable to it. It makes me unpredictable in ways that Force precognition can't anticipate. You read intentions through mystical connection. I make decisions based on logical analysis that exists entirely outside your mystical framework. He left without waiting for response, his footsteps echoing through the executor's corridors with the confidence of a man who had just informed the second most powerful being in the galaxy that supernatural power was merely another variable to calculate around. Behind him, Darth Vader stood in silence, considering the extraordinary arrogance, or absolute certainty, required to dismiss the Force so completely. And for the first time in years, he felt something that might have been genuine uncertainty about the outcome of this three-way war between Empire, Rebellion, and the legends from another galaxy. In a nondescript asteroid base in the Atreus sector, Wen-li stood before a holographic display showing the dispersed positions of his reorganized fleet while rebel leadership watched with expressions ranging from hope to skepticism. Mon Mothma, Admiral Akbar, and a dozen cell commanders had gathered for what Yang had described as strategic reorientation, a polite term for abandoning everything the rebellion thought it knew about warfare. What you've been doing isn't working, Yang said bluntly, gesturing at the display. 3 years of conventional guerrilla operations, thousands of lives lost, and the Empire is stronger now than when you started. The Death Star's destruction was a psychological victory, yes, but it didn't change the fundamental strategic situation. They have more ships, more resources, and now they have Reinhard von Lohengramm, who is categorically the most dangerous military mind in either galaxy. We've survived against impossible odds, General Dodonna objected. Our tactics may not have achieved decisive victory, but they've kept the rebellion alive when most predicted we'd be crushed within months. Survival isn't victory, Yang countered. And survival becomes exponentially harder when your enemy adapts to your tactics. Which Reinhard will. He's already analyzing your operational patterns, identifying predictable elements, calculating countermeasures. Within 6 months, maybe less, he'll have developed a systematic approach to eliminating rebel cells with brutal efficiency. So what do you propose? Mon Mothma asked, her politician's instincts recognizing Yang was building towards something specific. Yang manipulated the holographic display, highlighting dozens of systems across the outer and mid-rim. Complete operational dispersal combined with coordinated strategic targeting. My 8,000 ships, now split into units no larger than 50 vessels, operate as independent cells with full tactical autonomy. They don't report to Central Command, they don't follow predictable patrol routes, and they don't engage in any action that can be anticipated based on previous behavior. That's chaos, Akbar protested. How do you coordinate strategy without centralized command? You don't coordinate tactics, Yang explained patiently. You coordinate objectives. Each cell receives broad strategic goals: disrupt Imperial logistics in this sector, harass garrison forces here, create the appearance of large-scale operations there, but the specific timing, methodology, and target selection is left entirely to local commanders. The result is a military force that operates through emergent complexity rather than hierarchical control. He pulled up a different display, showing Imperial fleet dispositions. Reinhard's greatest strength is his ability to predict enemy actions and position forces to counter them. He's a strategic genius who wins by being 3 moves ahead of his opponents. But that ability requires opponents who operate according to predictable logic, doctrine, pattern recognition, rational decision-making. If we eliminate predictability entirely, if we make every engagement genuinely unpredictable because even we don't know what we're going to do until we do it, then his strategic genius becomes significantly less effective. "You're proposing we fight without strategy," one of the cell commanders said incredulously. "I'm proposing we fight with distributed strategy that emerges from local conditions rather than central planning," Yang corrected. It's the difference between a top-down hierarchy that Reinhard can analyze and predict, versus a bottom-up network that operates through principles rather than orders. Mon Mothma studied the display with the careful attention of someone who had spent years navigating political complexity. "You're describing a fundamental reorganization of the entire rebellion. That kind of change doesn't happen overnight, Admiral Yang. We have command structures, established hierarchies, political factions that won't accept dissolution of centralized authority." "Then you'll lose," Yang said simply. "Not quickly, not dramatically, but inevitably. Because Reinhard von Lohengramm doesn't lose to conventional opposition, and he doesn't make mistakes that create openings for desperate heroics. He wins through systematic strategic superiority, and the only way to fight that is to become systemically unpredictable." The room fell silent. Yang let the implication hang: join his strategic revolution or continue fighting a war they were mathematically certain to lose. Finally, Admiral Akbar spoke, his Mon Calamari features creased with thoughtful consideration. "If we implement this dispersed strategy, how do we measure success? Without centralized coordination, how do we know if we're winning or losing?" "We measure by Imperial response," Yang answered. "If they start pulling back from peripheral systems, concentrating forces around core worlds, implementing defensive rather than offensive posture, that's winning. If they maintain aggressive expansion, continue confident occupation of contested territories, operate without apparent concern about guerrilla activity, that's losing. The goal isn't to win battles. It's to make the Empire believe that controlling this galaxy costs more than it's worth." "Economic warfare," Mon Mothma murmured. "You're treating this as an economic problem rather than a military one." "All prolonged conflicts are ultimately economic," Yang agreed. "The side with deeper resources and greater willingness to spend them wins. But, willingness to spend is the critical variable. If we make every occupied system expensive to maintain, every supply convoy vulnerable to interdiction, every garrison force insufficient to maintain security, eventually the Empire's political will collapses even if their military capability remains intact." He took a sip of tea, his 20th cup in the past 6 hours, and continued. "Reinhard understands this intellectually, but he's never fought this kind of war. His experience is conventional fleet-scale operations where tactical genius determines outcomes. He's about to learn that genius, however extraordinary, has limitations when the rules of engagement fundamentally change." "And what about you?" one of the cell commanders asked quietly. "If we implement distributed operations with no central command, what role do you serve?" Yang smiled wearily. "The same role I've always served: strategic advisor, tactical consultant, and the person who takes responsibility when everything inevitably goes wrong. I won't command operations because that creates the centralized vulnerability Reinhard will target. But I'll be available for consultation, strategic analysis, and the occasional impossible battle that requires someone who specializes in winning through methods that shouldn't work." Mon Mothma stood, extending her hand. "Then let's build a rebellion that can't be predicted, can't be contained, and can't be defeated through conventional strategic superiority. Admiral Yang, you have my authorization to implement your reorganization. May the Force, she paused, recognizing Yang's disconnect from that mystical energy, may fortune favor our cause. As the meeting dissolved and commanders dispersed to implement Yang's strategic revolution, Frederica approached him with concern written across her features. Admiral, you realize what you've just done? You've made yourself obsolete. If operations are truly distributed with no central command, then you're no longer necessary. Exactly, Yang agreed quietly. And that's the point. Reinhard will be looking for me, the strategic center he can target to collapse the entire rebellion. If I'm not actually commanding anything, if I'm just one advisor among many, then eliminating me doesn't achieve decisive victory. He'll have to adapt to fighting an enemy with no head to cut off, no center to strike, no single point of failure. And you're comfortable with that? Frederica asked. With not being in command? Yang's smile was genuine for the first time in days. Lieutenant, I never wanted to be in command. I became an admiral because circumstances required it, not because I desired power. If I can win this war by making myself irrelevant, that's the best possible outcome, victory achieved through strategic design rather than personal heroics. He returned to studying the holographic display, watching as rebel cells began implementing their new dispersed doctrine across the galaxy. Somewhere in that same galaxy, Reinhard was planning his next move with the absolute confidence of a commander who had never lost a campaign. Yang had lost plenty of campaigns. He knew what defeat looked like, understood its texture and rhythm. And he had learned that sometimes the only way to avoid defeat was to refuse to play the game your opponent had mastered. The legend of the Galactic Heroes was about to discover that guerrilla warfare against a truly distributed insurgency was a different kind of impossible than any challenge he had faced before. And Yang suspected that in a collision between tactical genius and strategic patience, the outcome would reshape both galaxies forever. The Imperial shipyards at Kuat represented one of the galaxy's greatest concentrations of industrial capacity, kilometers of orbital construction facilities, hundreds of star destroyers in various stages of completion, and enough raw material to build fleets that could dominate entire sectors. It was also, as Reinhard's intelligence had determined, a critical strategic vulnerability that young Wen-li would eventually target. What Reinhard hadn't anticipated was how quickly Yang would strike, or how completely the attack would violate conventional military logic. The first indication came not from sensors or intelligence reports, but from panic transmissions from garrison commanders across 3 different sectors, all reporting simultaneous attacks by small alliance task forces. 50 ships here, 30 ships there, scattered raids that individually represented minor nuisances but collectively suggested something larger. Admiral Oberstein reported from his tactical station aboard the Brunhild, artificial eyes gleaming as he processed incoming data, were detecting coordinated offensive operations across 47 Imperial installations. Estimated enemy strength per engagement, 20 to 75 capital ships. Total enemy forces committed, approximately 3,000 ships distributed across a theater measuring 200 parsecs. Reinhard studied the holographic display with growing fascination. Yang has split his entire fleet into independent strike elements. No central coordination, no predictable targeting pattern, no strategic concentration of force. He traced the attack vectors with one finger. He's attacking everywhere simultaneously, which means he's attacking nowhere decisively. What's the objective? Unknown, Admiral, Mittermeier admitted from his command station. The targets are scattered, supply depots, communication relays, minor garrison posts. Nothing critical, nothing that threatens Imperial strategic capability. It's harassment warfare, but without clear purpose. Reinhard closed his eyes, visualizing the tactical situation as Yang would see it. Distributed forces, simultaneous attacks, no decisive objectives. It violated every principle of concentration that defined conventional military doctrine. Which meant it served a purpose that transcended conventional logic. He's probing, Reinhard said suddenly. Testing our response time, measuring fleet deployment patterns, identifying which systems we prioritize for reinforcement. These attacks aren't designed to achieve military victory, they're intelligence-gathering operations disguised as offensive action. Then we ignore them, Oberstein suggested. Refuse to respond, deny him the intelligence he seeks. We can't ignore them, Reinhard countered. Every attacked installation transmits distress calls, every garrison commander requests reinforcement. If we don't respond, we communicate that Imperial protection is conditional and unreliable. The political cost of appearing weak exceeds the strategic benefit of denying Yang intelligence. He opened his eyes, decision crystallizing. We respond, but we respond intelligently. Deploy rapid reaction forces to each attack site, but in standardized strength regardless of enemy numbers. Yang wants to learn our doctrine. We'll teach him a doctrine that reveals nothing, every response identical, every reinforcement predictable, every engagement following the same tactical template. That eliminates our strategic flexibility, Muller protested. It also eliminates the intelligence value of his probing attacks, Reinhard replied. Yang is trying to learn how we think, how we prioritize, where we concentrate forces. If every response is identical, he learns nothing except that we're not playing his game. Over the following 72 hours, Reinhard's fleet executed the most boring military campaign in either galaxy's history. 3,000 ships divided into 60 identical 50-ship response groups, each deployed to attack sites with mechanical precision, each engaging Yang's forces using identical tactical protocols, each withdrawing after exactly 30 minutes regardless of tactical situation. It was brilliantly effective at denying Yang intelligence. It was also, Reinhard realized with growing unease, exactly what Yang had wanted. The realization struck when communications across the Imperial network suddenly degraded, not catastrophically, but enough to introduce delays, create confusion, and complicate coordination. Simultaneously, long-range sensors detected massive hyperspace signatures near Kuat. "Admiral," his sensor officer shouted. Multiple fleet-scale contacts emerging at Kuat shipyards. Estimated strength, 5,000 capital ships. Reinhard's mind raced through implications. Yang had committed 3,000 ships to diversionary raids that forced Reinhard to disperse his fleet across 60 response groups. Which meant the remaining 5,000 ships, Yang's strategic reserve, were now concentrated at the most critical industrial target in the core worlds while Reinhard's forces were scattered across 200 parsecs of space. "Recall all response groups," Reinhard ordered, voice tight with controlled fury. "Maximum speed convergence on Kuat. And somebody explain how Yang assembled 5,000 ships at a critical target without our intelligence network detecting the concentration." "Admiral," Oberstein said quietly, displaying sensor logs, "he didn't concentrate them. Analysis of hyperspace signatures suggests those 5,000 ships jumped to Kuat from 5,000 different locations, arriving within a 3-minute window through what appears to be pre-coordinated navigation that required no central command structure." Reinhard stared at the data with something approaching awe. Yang had somehow coordinated 5,000 ships to arrive simultaneously at a target from 5,000 different starting points, without detectable communications, without central coordination, using nothing but prearranged timing and autonomous navigation. It was logistics as art form, coordination as strategic weapon, and it represented a level of distributed command capability that shouldn't have been possible. "How long until we can assemble sufficient forces to contest Kuat?" Reinhard asked. "Minimum 6 hours, Admiral, assuming maximum fleet velocity and optimal hyperspace routing." 6 hours. Yang would have 6 hours of uncontested access to the galaxy's premier shipbuilding facility. The damage he could inflict in that time would be catastrophic. "Execute recall," Reinhard ordered. "And transmit to Lord Vader, Yang Wen-li is attacking Kuat. If the Empire has any defensive forces in range, now would be the time to deploy them." At Kuat, Yang Wen-li stood on the Hyperion's bridge watching 5,000 capital ships organize into assault formation with the calm focus of a historian studying an ancient siege. The shipyard stretched across orbital space like geometric sculptures, construction frameworks surrounding half-built star destroyers, material processing stations feeding raw resources into fabrication facilities, defensive platforms that bristled with weapons designed to repel conventional assaults. Defensive platforms are powering weapons, Frederica reported. Estimated hostile strength, 200 heavy defense stations plus garrison fleet of approximately 400 Imperial-class star destroyers. They're organizing into defensive formation around the primary construction facilities. Expected, Yang said. They're trying to protect the most valuable assets. What's the civilian status? Shipyard workers are evacuating to designated shelters. Estimate 40,000 non-combatants still in the construction zones. Yang nodded slowly. This was the calculus of warfare that made him hate his profession, 40,000 lives whose survival depended on decisions made in the next few hours, caught between military necessity and human cost. All ships, implement precision targeting protocols, Yang ordered. I want defensive platforms eliminated with minimum collateral damage. No firing solutions that risk civilian sectors. And someone transmit to the garrison commander, we're targeting military infrastructure exclusively. Civilian evacuation will not be impeded. It was an extraordinary offer in the context of military operations, essentially announcing his tactical limitations to the enemy in exchange for reducing non-combatant casualties. Around the bridge, his officers exchanged uncertain glances, but none questioned the order. They had learned that Yang's seemingly irrational humanitarian concerns often serve strategic purposes beyond immediate tactical advantage. The battle for Kuat unfolded with methodical precision. Yang's forces concentrated overwhelming firepower on defensive platforms, eliminating them sequentially while the garrison fleet maneuvered desperately to create defensive positions that couldn't be exploited. But 5,000 ships against 600 was mathematics that courage couldn't overcome. Within 90 minutes, the defensive perimeter had collapsed completely. Begin secondary objectives, Yang ordered. Target priorities, construction facilities for star destroyers, materials processing plants, navigation computer fabrication centers. Avoid life support systems, habitation modules, and anything with civilian signatures. His fleet reorganized into precision strike elements, each targeting specific facilities with carefully calculated firepower, enough to destroy industrial capability without causing cascading failures that might kill evacuating workers. It was warfare as surgical procedure, destruction as precise instrument rather than blunt weapon. Admiral Merkatz reported from his flagship, we could eliminate the entire facility if we targeted structural supports and power infrastructure. Why are we being selective? Because destroying Kuat doesn't win the war, Yang explained patiently. It just creates martyrs and hardens Imperial resolve. What wins is making the cost of rebuilding exceed the strategic value of the facility, which means destroying military capacity while preserving civilian infrastructure that the Empire will feel obligated to protect and maintain. He highlighted several sections of the shipyard complex. Look at this. Worker habitation modules, medical facilities, recreational structures. Tens of thousands of civilians whose welfare the Empire now has to consider. If we destroy everything, the Empire simply rebuilds and militarizes completely. If we destroy selectively, they have to balance military reconstruction with civilian support, which drains resources and creates political complications. It was classic Yang strategy. Victory through complication rather than elimination, winning by making the enemy's problems multiply rather than seeking decisive destruction. The attack continued for 4 hours. By the time Reinhard's first response elements arrived at the system's edge, Yang had eliminated approximately 60% of Kuat's military construction capacity, destroyed every star destroyer that was more than 70% complete, and thoroughly wrecked the facilities that produced navigation computers and shield generators. The shipyard still existed, still functioned, but their military value had been reduced by more than half. Reinhard's forces are entering the system, Frederica reported. Estimated strength, 9,000 ships. Admiral, we need to withdraw, we can't contest those numbers. Agreed, Yang said. All ships, execute withdrawal protocol Delta. Dispersed hyperspace jumps, no ship traveling with more than 3 companions, rendezvous coordinates distributed according to prearranged schedules. Make sure Reinhard can't follow any single element back to a concentration point. The fleet dissolved like morning mist, 5,000 ships vanishing into hyperspace in 1,000 different directions, leaving no trace of where they might reconcentrate or what their next target might be. It was the operational dispersal Reinhard had feared, an enemy fleet that existed as a coherent strategic force but possessed no physical concentration point that could be targeted for decisive engagement. Reinhard arrived at Kuat to find the shipyards burning, not catastrophically, but extensively enough that months of reconstruction would be required before military production could resume at previous levels. And surrounding the damaged facilities, thousands of civilian workers who had survived specifically because Yang had chosen precision over total destruction. Damage assessment, Reinhard demanded, studying the devastation with controlled fury. 62% reduction in military construction capacity, Oberstein reported after analyzing structural scans. Estimated reconstruction timeline, 7 to 9 months assuming priority resource allocation. Civilian casualties, fewer than 300, most from accidents during evacuation rather than direct combat. 300, Reinhard repeated quietly. Yang had 5,000 ships and 4 hours of uncontested access. He could have killed 40,000 with trivial effort. He chose not to, Mittermeier observed. Why spare civilians when military logic suggests total destruction? Reinhard studied the holographic display showing Yang's withdrawal vectors, scattered, unpredictable, impossible to pursue effectively. Because Wen-li doesn't fight wars to kill people. He fights them to make continuation of the war politically and economically unsustainable. He gestured at the damaged shipyards. This isn't just a military attack. It's a political statement. I can strike your most critical assets, inflict devastating damage, and still demonstrate more concern for civilian welfare than your own empire does. The implication was devastating. The empire would have to rebuild Kuat while simultaneously acknowledging, at least implicitly, that their enemy had shown more restraint than their own military doctrine typically permitted. Every worker who survived because Yang had been selective would remember that distinction. Every family that didn't lose someone in an attack that could have been total would question why the Empire's own operations never showed similar concern. He's waging political warfare, Reinhard said with grudging admiration. Using military operations to create political complications that erode imperial legitimacy more effectively than any battlefield victory could achieve. So how do we counter it? Oberstein asked. Reinhard was silent for a long moment, studying the tactical situation with growing certainty that conventional strategic thinking would not suffice. Yang had transformed this war into something that transcended traditional military logic, a conflict where winning battles mattered less than winning the meta-narrative about which side deserved to rule. We can't counter it directly, Reinhard admitted finally. Because doing so requires us to adopt Yang's humanitarian constraints, which contradicts the fear-based doctrine that sustains imperial power. We're trapped in a strategic paradox: match Yang's restraint and undermine the empire's authoritarian foundation, or maintain imperial ruthlessness and prove Yang's implicit argument that we're the villains. Then we've lost? Mittermeier asked, disbelieving. No, Reinhard said slowly. We've just realized we're fighting the wrong war. Yang is trying to make this about political legitimacy and moral authority. We need to make it about something else, something where his humanitarian principles become a vulnerability rather than a strength. He turned to his assembled commanders, ice-blue eyes gleaming with the dangerous calculation that had made him legendary. Wen-li believes that restraint wins popular support and popular support determines political outcomes. He's probably right in the long term. But we don't need to win in the long term. We need to create a crisis that forces decisive engagement before his political strategy can fully mature. What kind of crisis? Oberstein asked. Reinhard's smile was cold. The kind that makes humanitarian restraint impossible. The kind that forces Yang to choose between his principles and immediate survival. The kind that proves strategic genius, however compassionate, still requires making choices that destroy what it seeks to protect. It was the strategy of a man who understood that when you couldn't win the game being played, you changed the game's fundamental rules. And Reinhard von Lohengramm had built his legend on changing rules that lesser commanders thought were immutable. The war for the galaxy was about to enter a new phase, one where moral authority would collide with ruthless necessity, and where two legendary commanders would discover that sometimes, winning meant sacrificing everything you fought to preserve. Emperor Palpatine's throne room on Coruscant had witnessed countless moments of galactic significance, but few as consequential as the strategy session now unfolding. Reinhard von Lohengramm stood before the Emperor with Darth Vader at his side, while holographic displays showed the deteriorating strategic situation across a dozen sectors. 7 major facilities attacked in the past month, Palpatine said, his voice carrying the rasp of calculated displeasure. Kuat, Fonder, Guerrilla, each strike precise, devastating, and executed before Imperial forces could respond. Your strategic genius, Admiral Lohengramm, seems inadequate to the task of containing one man. Young Wen-li is not one man, Reinhard replied evenly. He's a philosophy made manifest, distributed command, emergent strategy, warfare that operates outside conventional doctrine. You can't defeat him by predicting his actions because even he doesn't know what his forces will do until local commanders make autonomous decisions. Excuses, Palpatine hissed. I hired you to eliminate the rebellion, not to explain why you cannot. Reinhard's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. Then perhaps you should have hired a conventional admiral who would give you comfortable lies about inevitable victory. I give you uncomfortable truth. Yang has transformed this conflict into something that transcends military capability. He's waging economic and political warfare that makes every Imperial victory Pyrrhic and every setback a propaganda opportunity. So you admit defeat? Vader's mechanical breathing filled the silence following the question. I admit that conventional strategy is insufficient, Reinhard corrected. Which is why I'm proposing an unconventional operation, one that forces Yang into a tactical scenario where his humanitarian principles become a fatal vulnerability. He manipulated the holographic display, highlighting a cluster of systems in the mid-rim. The Bothan sector contains 17 inhabited worlds with significant civilian populations, approximately 8 billion sentients total. Current Imperial garrison strength is minimal, defensive capabilities inadequate. Yang's intelligence network will identify it as a high-value, low-risk target within the week. You want to use 8 billion people as bait? Even through Vader's vocabulator, the skepticism was apparent. I want to create a scenario where Yang must choose between strategic advantage and humanitarian principle, Reinhard clarified. We withdraw garrison forces from the Bothan sector, creating an apparent vacuum. Yang's forces will move to liberate those systems, which means taking responsibility for defending them. And then, his smile turned predatory, we return with overwhelming force and offer a choice, surrender unconditionally or watch those 8 billion civilians die when we implement base Delta Zero protocols on every inhabited planet in the sector. The throne room fell silent. When Palpatine spoke again, his voice carried genuine interest rather than mockery. You propose genocide as strategic leverage. I propose the credible threat of genocide, Reinhard corrected. The actual execution is unnecessary if Yang believes we'll follow through. And he will believe it, because your empire has already demonstrated willingness to destroy entire planets. Alderaan established that precedent. And if Yang calls your bluff? Vader asked. Then it's not a bluff, Reinhard said flatly. We execute base Delta Zero on one planet, select the least strategically valuable, give the population time to evacuate if possible, and demonstrate absolute commitment. Yang will surrender rather than let 7 additional planets die. Palpatine leaned forward, yellow eyes gleaming. You would murder billions to capture one admiral. I would threaten to murder billions, Reinhard clarified. The actual casualties depend entirely on Yang's response. He values civilian lives as much as his actions suggest, he'll surrender immediately. If he doesn't, then his humanitarian reputation was always fraudulent, and we've exposed him as a hypocrite while eliminating rebel leadership. It was monstrous logic, the kind of strategic calculation that reduced billions of lives to variables in a tactical equation. And yet, as Palpatine studied Reinhard's expression, he recognized something familiar, the absolute certainty of a being who had made ruthless decisions and would make them again without hesitation. Lord Vader, Palpatine said slowly, what is your assessment of this plan? It requires young Wen-li to act according to predictable moral constraints, Vader replied. Every strategic prediction about him has proven incorrect. What makes you believe he'll respond as anticipated? Because I know him, Reinhard said simply. I fought Yang for 10 years across our home galaxy. I've studied every battle, analyzed every decision, internalized his strategic philosophy. Yang Wen-li is many things, brilliant, unpredictable, frustratingly effective, but he is not willing to sacrifice innocent lives for military advantage. It's his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. Palpatine stood, robes falling around him like shadows given form. Very well, Admiral. You will have your opportunity. Withdraw forces from the Bothan sector, allow Yang to commit, then spring your trap. But understand, if this fails, if Yang escapes or turns your strategy against you, our arrangement terminates. The Empire has no use for strategic genius that cannot produce results. Understood, Your Majesty, Reinhard acknowledged. Though I should note that this operation requires your personal guarantee of commitment. Yang will not believe the threat of base Delta Zero unless he knows the Emperor himself has authorized it. Can you provide that guarantee? Palpatine's smile was terrible. Admiral Lohengramm, I destroyed Alderaan to make a political point. Do you truly doubt I would destroy 17 planets to win a war? The answer hung in the air like poison. Reinhard had his guarantee, and with it, the moral weight of potentially causing the greatest mass casualty event in galactic history. As he departed the throne room, Oberstein fell into step beside him. Admiral, that operation is predicated on assumptions about Yang's character that may no longer be valid. This galaxy has changed both of you. Are you certain he's still the man you knew? Reinhard was silent for a long moment. No, he admitted finally. I'm not certain of anything except that conventional warfare against Yang Wen-li is a losing proposition. This plan at least offers a scenario where his predictable elements, his humanitarian concerns, his unwillingness to sacrifice innocence, become exploitable. If I'm wrong about his character, he didn't finish the sentence. Then 8 billion people die because you miscalculated, Oberstein completed. Then 8 billion people die because Yang valued strategic flexibility over civilian protection, Reinhard corrected. The moral responsibility would be his, not mine. I'm simply creating the conditions where he must choose. It was the logic of a man who had conquered an empire and would do so again, regardless of the cost. And as Reinhard returned to the Brunhild to begin implementing the Bothan operation, he felt the familiar weight of command, the burden of making decisions that would echo through history, for good or ill. Yang Wen-li received the intelligence about Imperial withdrawal from the Bothan sector with immediate suspicion. He sat in the Hyperion's war room, studying tactical reports while Frederica and Merkatz waited for his assessment. 17 systems, 8 billion civilians, minimal garrison strength remaining, Yang murmured, reviewing the data. It's a trap. Obviously a trap. The only question is what kind. Could be a strategic withdrawal, Merkatz suggested. The Empire consolidating forces after our raids on their shipyards and supply infrastructure. They may not have sufficient resources to maintain strong garrisons everywhere. Reinhard doesn't withdraw, Yang countered. He repositions, he adapts, he counterattacks, but he doesn't abandon territory without strategic purpose. This is an invitation. He pulled up Reinhard's tactical history, reviewing battles from their shared past. He's trying to force me into a predictable response. Create an opportunity that I can't ignore for humanitarian reasons, then exploit my commitment to protecting civilians. So we ignore it? Frederica asked. Yang stood, pacing the war room with his hands clasped behind his back. Can we? 17 systems, 8 billion people, now vulnerable to Imperial reprisal because their garrison forces withdrew. If we don't move to protect them, and the Empire decides to make an example of one of those planets. Alderaan, Merkat said quietly. They've already proven willingness to destroy inhabited worlds. Exactly. Yang stopped pacing, his expression troubled. Reinhard knows I can't ignore this. He knows my humanitarian principles make me predictable in certain scenarios. He's weaponized that predictability, created a situation where doing nothing condemns billions, but doing something walks directly into whatever trap he's prepared. Then we find a third option, Frederica suggested. Something Reinhard won't anticipate because it doesn't fit either predictable response pattern. Yang smiled wearily. The problem with fighting strategic geniuses, Lieutenant, is that they anticipate third options. And fourth options. And every alternative you can imagine. He returned to the tactical display. But you're right, we need an approach that doesn't fit conventional logic. Which means, he trailed off, mind racing through possibilities. Admiral? Merkatz prompted. We accept the trap, Yang said slowly. But we do it knowing it's a trap, and we prepare for the worst-case scenario. Because Reinhard isn't trying to destroy my fleet, he could have attempted that at any point since Anoat. He's trying to force me into an impossible choice where either option results in catastrophic civilian casualties or my strategic neutralization. He highlighted the Bothan sector systems, studying their positions and defensive characteristics. Begin immediate evacuation operations. I want every transport vessel in the rebel fleet, every civilian freighter we can requisition, every ship capable of carrying passengers moving to Bothan space. We're going to evacuate 8 billion people before Reinhard springs his trap. That's impossible, Frederica protested. The logistics alone, fuel requirements, transport capacity, destination systems capable of absorbing that population, it would take months, maybe years. Then we have months or years, Yang said simply. And in the meantime, we make Reinhard's trap worthless. He's counting on those civilians being present to use as leverage. If they're not there, his entire strategic framework collapses. It was insane, impractical, and probably impossible. It was also classic young Wen-li, responding to an impossible situation by attempting something even more impossible that changed the fundamental parameters of the problem. Even if we begin evacuations, Merkatz pointed out, Reinhard will detect the operation and accelerate his timeline. We won't have months. We'll have weeks at most. Then we evacuate as many as we can in weeks, Yang replied. And we make sure the galaxy knows what we're doing and why. This becomes a propaganda operation as much as a humanitarian one, the rebellion evacuating billions while the Empire prepares to murder them. Let's see Reinhard try to maintain his alliance with Palpatine while the entire galaxy watches this moral calculation play out. He turned to his communications officer. Transmit on all frequencies, all channels, civilian and military. I want every news organization, every planetary government, every sentient being in this galaxy to know that the rebellion is evacuating the Bothan sector because we have credible intelligence that the Empire plans mass civilian casualties. Make it impossible for Palpatine to execute Base Delta Zero without the entire galaxy knowing it was premeditated genocide. It was brilliant in its audacity, turning Reinhard's trap into a political weapon against the Empire itself. The evacuation would fail, almost certainly. But the attempt, broadcast across the galaxy, would accomplish what military victories could not, demonstrate beyond doubt which side valued civilian lives and which saw them as expendable strategic resources. There's one problem, Frederica said quietly. If we commit our entire fleet to protecting the evacuation convoys, and Reinhard attacks with his full strength. Then we fight, Yang finished. Not a battle we chose, not on terrain that favors us, but a battle we can't avoid because retreating means abandoning billions to genocide. Which is exactly what Reinhard wants, a conventional engagement where his numerical and technological superiority guarantees victory. He sat back down, suddenly looking exhausted. I don't have a good solution, Lieutenant. I have a bad solution that might save some lives and a worse solution that definitely costs billions. So we're attempting the bad solution and hoping that somewhere in the execution, we find an angle that Reinhard didn't anticipate. Around the war room, his officers absorbed the grim reality. They were walking knowingly into Reinhard's trap because the alternative was unconscionable. It was the defining characteristic of young Wen-li's command philosophy: choose the option that preserves humanity even when it guarantees tactical disadvantage. The Bothan sector had become the galaxy's focal point, a sprawling theater of desperate humanity where thousands of transport ships crawled through space like refugees from a dying world, protected by Yang's scattered fleet elements stretched impossibly thin across 17 systems. Every hour, another million civilians evacuated. Every hour, Reinhard's forces drew closer. Yang stood aboard the Hyperion in orbit above Bothan, the sector's primary world, watching evacuation convoys depart with the grim certainty of a man who knew he had run out of time. Intelligence reported that Reinhard's main fleet, all 12,000 ships, had completed assembly at the sector's edge and would arrive within 6 hours. Yang's own forces, divided across 17 defensive positions protecting evacuation operations, numbered barely 7,000 operational vessels, with the remainder committed to escort duty for civilian transports. Current evacuation status, Yang requested quietly. Frederica consulted her display, her voice tight with exhaustion from 72 hours of continuous operations. 2.3 billion evacuated successfully. 5.7 billion remain. At current rate, we need another 16 days to complete full evacuation. We have 6 hours, Yang said. Which means 3/4 of the sector's population dies unless Reinhard chooses mercy. He won't, Admiral Merkat stated flatly. I've studied his tactical history, Admiral. Reinhard von Lohengramm does not bluff, does not make empty threats, and does not allow humanitarian concerns to override strategic objectives. Yang nodded slowly. I know. Which means we're not betting on his mercy. We're betting on his arrogance. He pulled up the tactical display showing fleet dispositions across the sector. Reinhard believes he's forced me into an impossible choice, surrender or watch billions die. But he's made an assumption, that I'll concentrate my fleet to defend the remaining population centers, creating the decisive battle he wants. What if I don't? Explain, Mon Mothma's voice came through the comm system. She had arrived at Bothan personally, refusing to direct evacuation operations from safety while billions faced extermination. Reinhard wants a battle, Yang said. He's engineered this entire scenario to force conventional fleet engagement where his numerical superiority guarantees victory. But what if instead of fighting, we evacuate ourselves? Every military vessel, every rebel asset, every resource, we abandon the Bothan sector completely and let Reinhard take it unopposed. The war room fell into shocked silence. Finally, Merkat spoke, his voice carrying barely controlled anger. Admiral, that condemns nearly 6 billion civilians to certain death. You would abandon them? I would save who we can save and acknowledge the brutal reality that we cannot save everyone, Ong replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion and resignation. If we stay and fight, Reinhard destroys our fleet and kills the civilians anyway. If we concentrate our forces in a desperate last stand, we lose the strategic dispersal that makes us effective. But if we evacuate everything, ships, personnel, political leadership, and broadcast our retreat across every channel, we turn Reinhard's trap into his greatest political liability. He gestured at the holographic display. Watch what happens when the galaxy sees this. The rebellion evacuated 2 billion civilians in 3 days, attempting the impossible to save lives. Then, when military defense became untenable, we withdrew rather than sacrifice our forces in futile last stands. Meanwhile, the Empire, which has all the resources necessary to evacuate the remaining population, instead implements Base Delta Zero and murders 6 billion sentients to prove a strategic point. That's cold calculus, Mon Mothma said quietly. You're sacrificing billions to win a propaganda victory. I'm acknowledging that they're already dead, Yang corrected. Reinhard made that decision when he engineered this trap. Our choice isn't between saving them or abandoning them. It's between dying uselessly alongside them or surviving to continue fighting a war that might eventually prevent future genocides. It was the cruelest logic of asymmetric warfare, accepting losses you couldn't prevent to preserve capability for battles you might win. Around the war room, Yang's officers struggled with the moral weight of the decision. There is one alternative, Frederica said slowly. A direct strike on Reinhard's flagship. If we could eliminate him personally, the entire Imperial fleet loses its command cohesion. His subordinates are competent, but none possess his strategic genius. Without Reinhard, they might hesitate, negotiate, or at least delay long enough to complete evacuations. Yang turned to her, studying his tactical officer's expression. You're proposing assassination. I'm proposing decapitation strike, Frederica corrected. Reinhard has made himself the linchpin of Imperial strategy in this galaxy. Remove him, and we create strategic opportunities that don't exist while he lives. It was tempting, brutally, pragmatically tempting. One successful strike, one lucky shot, one moment where the force or probability or desperate courage aligned, and the galaxy's most dangerous military mind would be eliminated. But Yang knew what that path led to, a war where commanders became legitimate targets, where assassination replaced strategy, where no leader could ever feel secure enough to negotiate rather than exterminate. No, Yang said finally. We don't assassinate opposing commanders. Not because it wouldn't work, but because it creates a precedent I won't accept. If we target Reinhard personally, we legitimize the Emperor targeting me, targeting Mon Mothma, targeting every rebel leader. This war degenerates into mutual assassination campaigns where strategic brilliance matters less than bodyguard efficiency. Even if refusing costs 6 billion lives. Merkatz pressed. Even then, Yang confirmed. Because accepting that calculus means accepting that individual lives don't matter, only strategic advantage. And once we accept that logic, we become indistinguishable from the empire we're fighting. He returned to the tactical display, studying evacuation routes and withdrawal vectors. Prepare fleet-wide dispersal. All military vessels will withdraw from Bothan space in 6 hours, maximum distribution pattern. Evacuation transports already departed will continue to designated refugee systems under minimal escort. Everything else, every ship, every soldier, every asset, survives to fight another day. And the civilians who remain? Mon Mothma asked. Yang closed his eyes. We'll die. And we will make absolutely certain that every sentient being in this galaxy knows who killed them and why. Reinhard von Lohengramm may win this battle. But he'll discover that some victories cost more than defeat. Aboard the Brunhild, Reinhard received confirmation that Yang's fleet was withdrawing with a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. The trap had worked. Yang was abandoning the Bothan sector, retreating rather than committing to the decisive battle Reinhard had engineered. And yet, something about the withdrawal pattern suggested this was exactly the response Yang had planned. They're not running, Oberstein observed, studying the tactical data. This is coordinated strategic dispersal. Yang is sacrificing the civilians deliberately, turning their deaths into political weapons against us. He's making us choose, Reinhard said quietly. Pursue his fleet and let the civilians evacuate unmolested, or implement base Delta Zero and prove we're the monsters his propaganda claims. It's elegant, he's turned our trap into his trap. Then we pursue, Mittermeier suggested. Yang's fleet is dispersed, vulnerable. We can destroy significant portions before they fully scatter. Reinhard shook his head. No. Yang wants us to pursue. It validates his narrative that the Empire was never interested in civilian casualties, only in destroying rebel forces. If we chase his fleet, we implicitly concede that the civilian population was always irrelevant to our strategic objectives. So we implement base Delta Zero? Oberstein asked. The question hung in the air like an execution notice. 6 billion lives, 17 inhabited worlds, the largest deliberate mass casualty event in galactic history, all to prove a strategic point that Yang had already undermined through his tactical withdrawal. "Admiral," his communications officer interrupted, "we're receiving transmissions from planetary governments across the Bothan sector. They're requesting Imperial protection, offering unconditional surrender, pledging loyalty to the Empire. They're asking us not to implement orbital bombardment." Reinhard studied the incoming transmissions, desperate pleas from local leaders who suddenly realized that their strategic value as bargaining chips had evaporated when Yang withdrew. They were offering everything: political capitulation, resource access, military cooperation, in exchange for the most basic guarantee that the Empire wouldn't murder them. "It's a hostage situation in reverse," Oberstein noted. "Usually, the hostage-taker threatens casualties if demands aren't met. Yang has arranged circumstances where we must commit genocide to achieve our stated objective of forcing his surrender. He's made us the hostage-takers." Reinhard felt something close to admiration. Yang had turned a trap designed to exploit his humanitarian principles into a political catastrophe that made Reinhard himself the villain. Every censor in the sector, every news organization, every planetary government was watching to see whether the Empire would accept surrender from billions of civilians or kill them anyway to prove strategic resolve. "Lord Vader," Reinhard said into his communicator, "I need to speak with the Emperor." Immediately. The holographic image of Palpatine materialized moments later, yellow eyes gleaming with malevolent interest. "Admiral Lohengramm. I trust you have good news about Yang Wen-li's surrender." "Yang has withdrawn his forces completely," Reinhard reported. "The civilian population remains and offers unconditional surrender. The tactical situation is complex." "Complex?" Palpatine's voice carried dangerous edge. "You engineered this scenario specifically to force Yang into impossible choices. He made his choice. Now execute base Delta Zero as planned and demonstrate the cost of defying Imperial authority. Your Majesty, the strategic situation has changed. The civilians offer surrender. I did not hire you to accept surrender from irrelevant populations." Palpatine's rage made the hologram flicker. "I hired you to eliminate Yang Wen-li. You claimed he would surrender rather than allow civilian casualties. He did not. Therefore, the casualties must occur exactly as you proposed, or your entire strategic framework was fraudulent from the beginning." Reinhard felt the trap's final mechanism click into place, not Yang's trap, but his own. He had proposed using genocide as leverage, confident Yang would surrender rather than allow it. Yang had called the bluff by withdrawing, and now the Emperor demanded Reinhard follow through on a threat that no longer served any strategic purpose beyond proving he wasn't bluffing. "Implement base Delta Zero," Palpatine commanded. "Kill every living thing on those 17 worlds. And then explain to me why I should continue employing a strategic genius who cannot anticipate his opponent's most obvious counter-strategy." The hologram vanished, leaving Reinhard standing in his command center with an order that would make him the architect of the galaxy's greatest genocide. Around him, his officers waited in tense silence. "Admiral?" Mittermeier prompted quietly. "Orders." Reinhard studied the tactical display showing 17 inhabited worlds, each icon representing hundreds of millions of lives. He had conquered an empire, defeated countless enemies, made decisions that killed thousands in pursuit of strategic objectives. But 6 billion civilians who offered surrender, who had committed no crime beyond existing in a location that temporarily served someone else's strategic purpose. "No," Reinhard said quietly. The bridge fell silent. "Admiral?" Oberstein's cold voice carried genuine surprise. "I said no," Reinhard repeated, louder now. "We will not implement base Delta Zero. We will accept the surrender of Bothan sector governments, establish garrison forces to maintain order, and begin integration of these systems into stable Imperial authority." "The Emperor ordered," Mittermeier began. "The Emperor ordered me to win this war," Reinhard interrupted. Genocide serves no strategic purpose now that Yang has withdrawn. It only creates martyrs, hardens rebel resolve, and proves Yang's propaganda correct. I will not murder 6 billion people to salvage tactical pride. Palpatine will consider this defiance, Oberstein warned. He may terminate our arrangement. He may declare us enemies of the Empire. Reinhard smiled coldly. Then let him try. We have 12,000 of the most advanced warships in either galaxy, commanded by officers who follow me, not him. If the Emperor wants a war against the rebellion and my fleet simultaneously, he'll discover that supernatural power is less decisive than he believes when confronted with genuine strategic competence. It was sedition, possibly treason, certainly the end of their Imperial alliance. But Reinhard had not conquered an empire by accepting other men's authority, and he would not start now, not even for an emperor who could choke him with a gesture. Transmit to all Bothan sector governments, Reinhard ordered. The Imperial fleet accepts your surrender. Garrison forces will arrive within 48 hours. Civilian casualties will be minimal and limited to security enforcement. Anyone who cooperates with the transition will be treated as citizens of the Galactic Empire, with all protections that status entails. As his communications officer transmitted the message, Reinhard turned to Oberstein. And prepare a transmission for young Wen-li. I suspect he'll want to know that his gambit succeeded. Yang received Reinhard's decision aboard a transport ship fleeing the Bothan sector, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a genuine smile. He refused, Frederica said, reading the decoded transmission. Reinhard refused the Emperor's order to implement base Delta Zero. 6 billion people are alive because he chose mercy over strategic consistency. Not mercy, Yang corrected gently. Strategy. Reinhard recognized that genocide no longer served any purpose except proving he wasn't bluffing. And he values strategic effectiveness over ego. He studied the message again. But this changes everything. Reinhard just defied the Emperor publicly, which means the Imperial alliance is probably over. We're back to a three-way war, Empire, Rebellion, and Reinhard's independent fleet. Is that better or worse for us? Merkatz asked. Yang considered the question carefully. Better tactically, two enemies fighting each other is preferable to one unified opposition. Worse strategically, Reinhard unbound from Imperial political constraints is even more dangerous than Reinhard working within them. And worst of all philosophically, because it means the galaxy's most brilliant military mind just proved he possesses genuine moral constraints. That's bad? Frederica asked, confused. It's complicated, Yang replied. Easier to fight monsters than men. Monsters you can oppose without doubt. Men who make difficult moral choices, who refuse genocide even when strategically convenient, who demonstrate honor in the midst of war, those men you have to respect even while fighting them. And that makes victory feel less like triumph and more like tragedy. He looked out the viewport at the stars of a galaxy that had suddenly become more complicated and more dangerous. Somewhere out there, Reinhard von Lohengramm had just made an enemy of the Empire he'd allied with. And somewhere else, Emperor Palpatine was undoubtedly planning how to destroy both legends who had entered his galaxy and refused to play by his rules. The Battle of Bothan had ended without the decisive engagement either commander wanted. But the war, the true war that would determine this galaxy's future, had only just begun. The Imperial throne room on Coruscant had witnessed countless moments of calculated cruelty, but the confrontation unfolding now carried a different quality, not mere displeasure, but genuine Imperial wrath focused on the one being who had dared defy the Emperor's explicit command. Darth Vader stood to Palpatine's right, a silent pillar of dark authority, while Reinhard von Lohengramm faced them both with the same ice-cold composure he had maintained throughout their alliance. Behind Reinhard, transmitted holographically from the Brunhild, stood Oberstein, Mittermeier, and Muller, a clear statement that this was not one admiral's defiance but a unified fleet command's decision. You refused my order, Palpatine said, voice carrying the controlled fury of absolute power confronted with unexpected resistance. I commanded base Delta Zero on 17 worlds. You accepted their surrender instead. Explain your treason, Admiral Lohengramm. I committed no treason, Reinhard replied evenly. Our agreement specified that I would operate as an autonomous allied force with strategic independence. I exercised that independence when your order ceased to serve any military purpose beyond satisfying wounded pride. The temperature in the throne room dropped. Vader's hand moved fractionally toward his lightsaber, but Palpatine raised one withered hand, stopping his apprentice, not yet ready to escalate to open violence. You dare, Palpatine began. I dare state obvious strategic reality, Reinhard interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that had made him legend. Young Wen-li withdrew his forces, eliminating the tactical justification for civilian casualties. Implementing base Delta Zero after his withdrawal would have accomplished nothing except creating 6 billion martyrs and validating every piece of rebel propaganda about Imperial brutality. I chose strategic effectiveness over theatrical cruelty. You chose defiance, Palpatine hissed. You placed your judgment above Imperial authority. That is the definition of treason. Reinhard's smile was sharp and dangerous. Then execute me for treason, Emperor. Send Lord Vader to destroy the Brunhild. Deploy your fleets to engage mine. And discover whether the Force provides sufficient advantage when facing 12,000 ships commanded by officers who have won more battles than your entire military has fought in the past decade. It was an extraordinarily dangerous gambit, threatening the Emperor in his own throne room, backed only by military capability and strategic confidence. Around the throne room, Imperial officers tensed, awaiting the command that would transform their greatest asset into their deadliest enemy. But Palpatine did not give that command. Instead, he leaned back, studying Reinhard with eyes that glowed with malevolent calculation. You believe your ships make you invulnerable, Palpatine said slowly. You believe strategic genius protects you from consequences. You are wrong, Admiral. The Force is not merely power, it is inevitability. It flows through all things, connects all beings, and ultimately determines all outcomes. Your technology, your tactics, your legendary brilliance, all meaningless against a power that transcends material reality. Then demonstrate it, Reinhard challenged. If the Force is as absolute as you claim, destroy my fleet. Prove that mystical power exceeds strategic competence. Or admit that your empire requires my military capability more than I require your resources, and negotiate like rational beings instead of posturing like religious zealots. For a heartbeat, Palpatine seemed ready to accept the challenge, to unleash whatever dark powers he possessed against Reinhard's calculated defiance. But then, slowly, his expression shifted from rage to something more calculating. You are interesting, Admiral Lohengramm, Palpatine said finally. Arrogant beyond measure, defiant beyond reason, and yet, effective. Your refusal to implement base Delta Zero, while strategically sound as you claim, has created an unexpected complication. The Bothan sector now views you as their savior, the Imperial commander who chose mercy over massacre. That carries political value. I'm not interested in political value, Reinhard stated. I'm interested in ending this war and establishing stable governance. Your current approach, rule through fear, suppress dissent through overwhelming violence, rely on supernatural intimidation, is strategically unsustainable. Eventually, the costs of maintaining control exceed the benefits of conquered territory, and empires collapse from internal contradictions. You presume to lecture me on governance? Palpatine's voice carried genuine amusement now. I who transformed a republic into an empire, who eliminated the Jedi Order, who rule 1,000,000 worlds through fear alone. I presume to state that fear is a poor foundation for lasting power, Reinhard replied. I conquered my home empire through strategic superiority and offered my defeated enemies positions of honor in the new order. They followed me not because they feared me, but because I provided stable governance superior to the corrupt dynasty I replaced. That is how empires endure, through competence, not terror. The throne room fell silent. When Palpatine spoke again, his tone had shifted to something almost conversational. You wish to rebuild my empire according to your principles. You believe you can succeed where I have not. Very well, Admiral, I offer you a test. Take the Bothan sector. Govern it according to your superior methods. Demonstrate that competence and honor create more stable rule than fear and power. And we shall observe which philosophy proves more effective. It was a trap, obviously, giving Reinhard limited authority while maintaining overarching imperial control, setting him up to fail and then using that failure as justification for his elimination. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate that a different approach to governance could succeed, even in a galaxy corrupted by decades of authoritarian rule. I accept, Reinhard said. With one condition, complete administrative autonomy within Bothan sector. No imperial oversight, no interference from your MOFs or regional governors, no deployment of inquisitors or intelligence assets without my explicit approval. You want to test my methods? Then let me implement them without sabotage. Palpatine's smile widened. Agreed. The Bothan sector is yours, Admiral Lohengramm. Rule it as you see fit. And when your principles collide with reality, when populations you treat with honor still rebel, when governance through competence proves insufficient against those who prefer chaos to order, then we shall discuss which philosophy truly sustains empires. Reinhard bowed slightly, acknowledgement of temporary agreement, not submission, and his holographic image vanished, leaving Vader alone with the Emperor. Master, Vader said quietly, you have given him exactly what he wants. An independent power base, political legitimacy, opportunity to demonstrate alternatives to Imperial doctrine. This seems unwise. On the contrary, my apprentice, this is perfect, Palpatine replied, his voice carrying dark satisfaction. Reinhard von Lohengramm believes he can reform governance through superior administration. He will fail, not because his methods are flawed, but because young Wen-li will ensure his failure. The rebellion cannot allow a benevolent, imperial successor to succeed. They must destroy Reinhard's experiment or risk losing the moral authority that sustains their insurgency. Understanding dawned in Vader's consciousness. You are setting them against each other again. Reinhard attempts to govern, Yang must disrupt that governance to prevent legitimization of imperial authority. They destroy each other while the empire remains intact. Precisely, Palpatine confirmed. And when both legends have exhausted themselves fighting over 17 systems that mean nothing to me, when their fleets are weakened and their reputations shattered, then we eliminate the survivors and return to the natural order, absolute imperial authority, maintained through the only true power in this galaxy, the dark side of the Force. It was masterful manipulation, turning defiance into strategic advantage, transforming Reinhard's moral stand into the mechanism of his own destruction. And neither Reinhard nor Yang would see it coming until far too late. 3 parsecs from Coruscant, aboard the Hyperion, Yang Wen-li studied intelligence reports about Reinhard's new autonomous authority over Bothan sector with the expression of a historian watching tragedy unfold in real time. He's going to try to govern properly, Yang murmured, reviewing the preliminary administrative directives Reinhard had already issued, establishment of civilian councils, protection of civil liberties, economic reconstruction programs, even preliminary amnesty for rebel sympathizers who agreed to peaceful integration. He actually believes he can demonstrate benevolent authoritarianism. Is that not better than malevolent authoritarianism? Mon Mothma asked. She had come aboard the Hyperion specifically for this strategic assessment, recognizing that Reinhard's new role changed the entire conflict calculus. It's more dangerous, Yang replied. Palpatine rules through fear and anyone with courage can resist fear. But Reinhard offers competent governance, security, prosperity, all the things populations actually want. If he succeeds in Bothan sector, if he demonstrates that imperial authority can be exercised with justice rather than cruelty, then he undermines the entire philosophical foundation of our rebellion. So we disrupt his governance, General Dodonna suggested. Foment unrest, conduct operations that destabilize his administration, prove that imperial authority, however benevolent, still depends on military force. Yang closed his eyes, feeling the weight of another impossible decision settling on his shoulders. You're asking me to sabotage good governance. To deliberately make billions of lives worse in order to preserve our political narrative. That's necessary, Mon Mothma finished quietly. I take no pleasure in it, Admiral Yang. But you're correct, if Reinhard succeeds, if he demonstrates that reformed imperial authority can provide stability and prosperity, then why would population support a rebellion that offers only continued warfare and uncertain outcomes? We must prove that any imperial authority is unacceptable, even competent authority. It was the cruelest logic of revolutionary warfare. Sometimes you had to oppose good governance because accepting it legitimized the system you sought to overthrow. Yang had read about such situations in historical texts, had analyzed revolutionary movements that faced similar dilemmas. He had never imagined he would face the choice himself. There is another option, Frederica said quietly. We could do nothing. Let Reinhard govern Bothan sector. Observe whether his methods actually work. If they succeed, perhaps imperial authority can be reformed rather than destroyed. If they fail, we've lost nothing by waiting. If they succeed, we've legitimized authoritarian governance, Yang countered. Given populations permission to accept imperial rule as long as it's exercised competently. That's not freedom, that's enlightened despotism, which is still despotism. He opened his eyes, looking at Mon Mothma. You want me to destabilize Bothan sector? To make Reinhard's governance fail even if his methods are sound? To prove that imperial authority cannot coexist with genuine popular welfare? I'm asking you to preserve the rebellion's moral authority, Mon Mothma replied. Which requires demonstrating that the empire, in any form, is incompatible with freedom. Can you do that, Admiral Yang? Can you sabotage competent governance for strategic necessity? Yang stood, walking to the viewport to stare at stars that had witnessed billions of years of conflict, rise and fall of countless civilizations, the eternal cycle of order and chaos that defined galactic history. Yes, he said finally. I can do it. Because Reinhard is still serving the Emperor, still operating under imperial authority, still maintaining a system that tolerates Palpatine's existence. As long as he serves that empire, however competently, however justly, he legitimizes the very power structure that destroyed Alderaan, that enslaved entire species, that murdered the Jedi and corrupted the Republic. He turned back to face Mon Mothma. But understand what we're doing. We're choosing to make people's lives worse in the short term to preserve the possibility of better lives in the long term. We're sabotaging good governance because accepting it means surrendering the dream of genuine freedom. It's morally complicated, strategically necessary, and it will haunt me for however long I survive this war. That's why you're the right person to do it, Mon Mothma said gently. Because you understand the moral cost and will minimize the human suffering involved. Someone else might simply destroy Bothan sector to prevent Reinhard's success. You'll find a way to disrupt his governance while preserving as many lives as possible. Yang nodded slowly, already calculating how to sabotage an administration run by the most competent military mind in either galaxy. It would require subtlety, patience, and operations that appeared organic rather than orchestrated. Economic disruption, not terrorism. Political agitation, not massacres. Creating the conditions where Reinhard's competent governance couldn't overcome systemic instability, proving that imperial authority was fundamentally incompatible with lasting peace. Begin intelligence operations in Bothan sector, Yang ordered. I want complete information on Reinhard's administrative structure, economic vulnerabilities, political factions that might resist integration. We're going to teach the galaxy that you can't reform tyranny, you can only replace it. As Mon Mothma departed and Yang's staff began implementing his directives, he felt the familiar weight of command, the burden of making decisions that would affect billions of lives, most of whom would never know his name or understand the strategic calculations that determined their fates. Across the galaxy, Reinhard von Lohengramm was preparing to demonstrate that genius could reform even corrupt systems, that competent governance could succeed where brutal oppression had failed. And young Wen-li was preparing to prove him wrong, not because he wanted to, but because allowing him to succeed meant surrendering everything the rebellion represented. The final confrontation between two legends from another galaxy was approaching. And this time, the battlefield wouldn't be measured in ships destroyed or territory conquered, but in the hearts and minds of billions who would decide whether freedom or order, chaos or stability, revolution or reform represented humanity's best future. The Galactic Civil War had transcended military conflict entirely. And neither legend would emerge unchanged from what came next. In his throne room on Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine felt through the Force the convergence of possibilities, Reinhard attempting governance, Yang preparing disruption, two extraordinary minds focused entirely on each other while the true power in the galaxy orchestrated their mutual destruction. Let them fight, Palpatine whispered to the empty darkness. Let them exhaust their brilliance on philosophical questions that have no answers. And when they have proven that neither tactical genius nor moral conviction can challenge power rooted in the Force itself, then the galaxy will remember why emperors rule and legends die. The dark side whispered agreement, flowing through the shadows like promise of inevitable victory. And across the galaxy, two men who had never asked to be legends prepared for a conflict that would determine not just their fates, but the future of every sentient being who believed that something better than endless tyranny might be possible. The Battle of Bothan had ended. But the war for the galaxy's soul had only just begun. The galaxy far, far away had been forever changed by the arrival of two fleets from another universe, carrying with them philosophies of warfare and governance that neither the Empire nor the Rebellion had encountered before. What began as a simple dimensional accident had evolved into a three-way ideological struggle that transcended conventional military conflict entirely. Reinhard von Lohengramm stood in the administrative center of Bothan, formerly a rebel-sympathetic world, now the capital of his experimental governance zone. Around him, holographic displays showed economic indicators rising, crime rates falling, and civilian satisfaction metrics climbing toward levels unseen under traditional imperial rule. His officers had implemented systems combining imperial efficiency with meritocratic principles, creating an administration that governed through competence rather than fear. Yet Reinhard understood the paradox he embodied, a conqueror who claimed to offer freedom, an authoritarian who preached justice, a servant of an empire he fundamentally disagreed with. He had saved 6 billion lives by defying the Emperor, and in doing so, had proven that even legends must sometimes choose between orders and conscience. Yang Wen-li observed Bothan's transformation from hidden safehouses scattered across the sector, coordinating disruption operations that he knew were morally complicated but strategically necessary. His cells fomented labor disputes at Reinhard's reconstruction sites, spread political propaganda questioning whether benevolent dictatorship was any better than brutal tyranny, and created economic instabilities that even Reinhard's administrative genius struggled to resolve. Yang took no pleasure in sabotaging governance that genuinely improved people's lives, but he understood that accepting Reinhard's success meant surrendering the principle that freedom, however chaotic, was preferable to order imposed by authoritarian power. The historian in him recognized the tragedy: two men who should have been allies, divided by circumstance and political necessity, locked in a conflict where neither could afford to lose. Emperor Palpatine watched from Coruscant with dark satisfaction as his predictions manifested exactly as the Force had shown him. Reinhard and Yang, two of the most brilliant strategic minds in any galaxy, were so focused on their philosophical struggle that neither recognized they were pieces in a larger game. The Emperor had allowed Reinhard his autonomous zone not as genuine compromise but as psychological weapon, creating the conditions where Yang must oppose good governance, where the rebellion's moral authority would be tested against pragmatic results. When both legends exhausted themselves, when their fleets were weakened by internal conflict and their reputations tarnished by impossible choices, then Palpatine would sweep away the remnants and restore absolute imperial authority. The Force had brought these outsiders to his galaxy, and the Force would ensure their ultimate irrelevance. Yet the Force, for all its power, could not predict what happened when human will collided with mystical inevitability. Reinhard's governance experiment in Bothan sector began demonstrating results that even Yang's disruption couldn't fully negate: populations experiencing prosperity, security, and justice for the first time in decades started questioning whether the rebellion's promise of freedom was worth returning to the chaos that had preceded Imperial order. Simultaneously, Yang's operations revealed something Palpatine hadn't anticipated. Even Imperial citizens began asking why Reinhard's benevolent administration was the exception rather than the rule, why other sectors suffered under brutal moffs while Bothan's sector thrived under principled military governance. The inadvertent result was revolutionary, not the rebellion's military revolution, but an ideological revolution that questioned the fundamental assumptions sustaining both empire and rebellion. If imperial authority could be exercised justly, as Reinhard demonstrated, then perhaps the system itself wasn't irredeemable. But if even just imperial authority required constant resistance to prevent legitimization of authoritarian power, as Yang argued, then what did that say about humanity's capacity for self-governance? The questions rippled across the galaxy, transmitted through news networks, debated in Senate chambers that still technically existed, discussed in cantinas from the core to the outer rim. Darth Vader, observing these developments with the cold pragmatism that made him the Empire's most effective enforcer, recognized something his master might not yet see. The legend of the Galactic Heroes had introduced a variable the Force couldn't fully calculate, the possibility that competence and principle might matter more than mystical power. Reinhard governed without Force sensitivity, Yang won battles without precognition, and both demonstrated that strategic genius rooted in human intellect could challenge supposedly inevitable outcomes. For a Sith Lord whose entire philosophy centered on power through the Force, this represented a troubling implication. What if the galaxy's future wasn't determined by light versus dark, but by the eternal struggle between order and freedom, competence and compassion, pragmatism and principle? The war continued across dozens of sectors, Reinhard's fleet maintaining his autonomous zone while periodically clashing with Yang's distributed cells, the Emperor's forces attempting to contain both while maintaining control over the broader empire, and the rebellion struggling to navigate the impossible choice between supporting Yang's disruption of good governance or accepting that their enemy had demonstrated capacity for genuine reform. There were victories and defeats, alliances and betrayals, moments of heroism and depths of moral compromise that left everyone involved questioning whether they were fighting for justice or simply perpetuating an endless cycle of conflict. But something had changed fundamentally. The galaxy that had known only the simple binary of empire versus rebellion now grappled with more complex questions. Could authoritarian systems be reformed, or must they be destroyed entirely? Was competent dictatorship preferable to chaotic freedom? Could strategic genius overcome mystical power, or did the Force ultimately determine all outcomes? These questions had no easy answers, no decisive resolution, only the ongoing struggle of billions of sentient beings trying to determine their own fate. The legend of the Galactic Heroes had arrived in a galaxy far, far away, expecting to find familiar patterns: war, conquest, political maneuvering, the eternal dance of power that defined civilized space. Instead, they discovered a galaxy where mystical energy bound all living things, where supernatural abilities shaped history, where the Force itself seemed to possess intent and agency beyond mere physical law. Reinhard and Yang, for all their brilliance, were navigating a reality that operated on principles their training hadn't prepared them for. And yet, they persisted. Reinhard continued building his vision of enlightened imperial governance, refusing to accept that authoritarianism must inevitably devolve into tyranny. Yang continued his campaign of principled disruption, unwilling to concede that freedom required accepting perpetual instability. Both men understood they might never return to their home galaxy, might die in this unfamiliar space-fighting wars that weren't originally theirs. But having entered this conflict, having affected billions of lives through their presence, they could not simply withdraw and pretend their choices didn't matter. The future remained uncertain. Palpatine's dark machinations continued unabated. The rebellion's desperate struggle persisted across 1,000 worlds. And two legends from another galaxy fought their endless philosophical war, each trying to prove that human genius, whether expressed as conquering ambition or defensive compassion, could shape destiny even in a universe where the Force connected all things. Perhaps that was the ultimate answer the legend of the Galactic Heroes brought to Star Wars, that destiny was not inevitable, that power alone did not determine outcomes, and that even in a galaxy bound by mystical energy, human choice, strategic brilliance, and moral conviction still mattered. Whether that would be enough to overcome emperors and force users, whether genius could triumph over supernatural power, whether legends could reshape galaxies, those questions awaited resolution in battles yet to be fought, choices yet to be made, and futures yet to be written. The war continued. The legends endured. And the galaxy would never be the same. May the Force be with you. More stories await.